Your high school history textbook lied to you, not through malice but through omission. Everything you learned was just the highlight reel, the sanitized, simplified version designed to make you feel good about America. But what if I told you the most important chapters of our story were ripped out before you ever saw them? The parts too messy, too uncomfortable, too damn inconvenient for the official narrative. Tonight we're reading the missing pages, and fair warning, once you see what they cut out, you can never unsee it. Once you understand how much has been hidden from you, you'll start questioning everything you thought you knew about this country. You'll start wondering what else they've been hiding, what other truths have been buried under layers of comfortable mythology. What's up, truth seekers? Welcome back to the channel where we don't just tell you what happened. We tell you what they don't want you to know happened. If you're new here, strap yourself in because we're about to take a ride through the shadow side of American history. We dig into America's buried secrets, the stories that got deleted from the official record, because they make powerful people uncomfortable. I'm talking about stories so explosive, so paradigm-shifting, that entire institutions have spent decades, sometimes centuries, making sure you never heard them. Stories that don't just change how you see the past, they fundamentally alter how you understand the present. Because here's the thing about buried history. It's not really buried. It's still here, still breathing, still shaping everything around us, still echoing in every headline and every injustice and every moment. When you think, how the hell did we get here? These aren't just forgotten footnotes or obscure academic curiosities. These are foundational stories that explain how America actually works, as opposed to how we're told it works. They reveal the mechanisms of power, the patterns of oppression, and the cycles of resistance that have shaped this country from its very beginning. Tonight isn't about George Washington's wooden teeth or how many states Lincoln visited or any of the comfortable fairy tales they fed you in school. We're going where textbooks fear to tread, where curriculum committees draw their red lines, where the official narrative breaks down, and the real story begins. We're uncovering 5 American stories, so explosive, so paradigm-shifting, they've been systematically erased from public memory. And once you hear them, you'll never look at American history the same way again. Here's what I need you to do right now. Get comfortable, grab your favorite drink, dim those lights, maybe throw on some headphones. Turn off your phone notifications because this is going to be a journey, and I want you fully immersed. We're going deep tonight, deeper than most people are willing to go into the shadows where the real story lives. And if you're ready to have your mind blown by the real unfiltered story of America, if you're ready to see past the propaganda and into the truth, smash that subscribe button. But I'm giving you fair warning, once you go down this rabbit hole, there's no going back. To thinking America's story is simple, you'll start seeing the patterns, the cover-ups, the systematic erasure of inconvenient truths. You'll start noticing how power protects itself by controlling the narrative. And you might find that disturbing, disorienting, even depressing. Good. Disturbance is the beginning of understanding. Disorientation is the first step toward reorientation. And a little depression about the past might be necessary to create hope for the future. 5 forgotten chapters await us tonight. Each one is a different kind of erasure, a different way that power protects itself by controlling the story. Each represents a different method of making inconvenient truths disappear, sometimes through violence, sometimes through silence, sometimes through the slow, patient work of rewriting history to make the powerful look inevitable and the powerless look deserving of their fate. First, a Native American republic that outgoverned most white states, proving that civilization was just a racist excuse for theft and genocide. We'll explore how the Cherokee Nation created a constitutional democracy more advanced than most American states, only to be destroyed not for their failures, but for their successes. Second, a Black Wall Street so prosperous they had to burn it down with actual airplanes dropping actual bombs because Black economic independence was an existential threat to white supremacy itself. We'll witness the systematic destruction of generational wealth and the conspiracy of silence that followed. Third, a war on American soil bigger than most foreign conflicts, where 10,000 American workers took up arms against corporate tyranny in the largest labor uprising since the Civil War. We'll hear the echo of gunfire from Blair Mountain and understand why they don't teach you about American workers going to war against American corporations. Fourth, a Christian sex commune that somehow became your grandmother's silverware company, proving that American sexual liberation and social experimentation have much deeper roots than anyone wants to admit. We'll discover how the most radical social experiment in American history evolved into one of the most conventional business success stories. And fifth, an immigration system so deliberately cruel, it forced thousands of people to live their entire lives as someone else, turning identity itself into a form of resistance against institutional racism. We'll enter the world of the paper sons and daughters who bought fake families and memorized fictional lives to achieve real American dreams. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are the foundation stones of modern America, the buried truths that explain why our country works the way it does. They're the stories that power doesn't want you to know, because knowledge is the enemy of control, because understanding the past threatens the present, because recognizing patterns of oppression makes you dangerous to systems that depend on ignorance. Ready to see what they cut from the final edit? Ready to understand why they cut it? Ready to see the patterns that connect these buried stories to everything happening right now? Ready to discover that the America you thought you knew is just the tip of a much darker, much more complex, much more interesting iceberg? Let's step into the shadows and find out what America really is when you strip away the mythology and face the raw, unfiltered truth. Forget every Hollywood Western you've ever seen. Forget the noble savage mythology and the victim narratives. Forget the idea that European contact brought civilization to a savage wilderness. In 1820, while white Americans were still figuring out democracy and struggling with the basic concepts of constitutional government, the Cherokee Nation wasn't just surviving. They were thriving with a government so sophisticated it would make modern politicians weep with envy. And picture this: you're walking through New Dakota, the Cherokee capital, on a crisp autumn morning in 1825. The sun glints off the windows of the two-story Supreme Court building, a structure that wouldn't look out of place in any state capital. You hear the rhythmic thunk, thunk, thunk of the printing press at the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper office, where bilingual journalists are typesetting stories in both Cherokee syllabary and English. Children's voices drift from the schoolhouse, where Cherokee kids are becoming fluent in 2 languages before age 10, achieving literacy rates that surpass most white communities in Georgia. You see a constitution hanging in the council house that's frankly better written, more thoughtful, and more democratic than most state constitutions of the era. You witness a functioning 3-branch government with executive, legislative, and judicial powers carefully balanced and separated. You observe a bicameral legislature where representatives debate complex issues in Cherokee and English, making decisions that affect thousands of people across millions of acres of sovereign territory. This isn't some romantic, noble, savage fantasy concocted by guilty white liberals. This is hard, documented historical fact that makes American exceptionalism look like a joke. The Cherokee had created a functioning constitutional republic that combined the best of traditional Cherokee values with innovative democratic institutions. They had separation of powers, checks and balances, a bicameral legislature, an independent judiciary, and a written constitution that explicitly protected individual rights. But you've probably never heard of New Dakota. You've never learned about Cherokee democracy in any detail. You might have gotten a brief mention of Sequoyah and his syllabary, but you've never been taught that the Cherokee Nation was more literate, more democratic, and more stable than most American states of the same period. Why? Because acknowledging Cherokee sophistication makes Indian removal look like what it actually was, not the tragic but inevitable clash of civilization with savagery, but the calculated destruction of a successful rival government by a greedier, less principled, more violent neighbor. Meet Sequoyah, born George, just a man who makes every modern tech innovator look like an underachiever. While Mark Zuckerberg connected college kids so they could waste time and spread misinformation, Sequoyah created something genuinely revolutionary. He gave an entire civilization the gift of literacy in their own language. Imagine the intellectual audacity required for such a task. Sequoyah couldn't read or write in any language when he began his project. He understood that Cherokee people were using English for official business, and that this dependence on a foreign language weakened Cherokee sovereignty. So he set out to solve a problem that had stumped the greatest minds in human history: how to represent the sounds of human speech in visual symbols. Most writing systems evolved gradually over centuries or millennia, built on the accumulated work of countless individuals across generations. Sequoyah did it alone in 12 years, through pure intellectual determination and systematic experimentation. He started by creating symbols for individual words like Chinese characters, but quickly realized this approach would require thousands of symbols. Then he made the breakthrough that eluded most ancient civilizations. He understood that human speech could be broken down into a limited number of distinct sounds, and that representing those sounds rather than whole words would make literacy achievable for ordinary people. The Cherokee syllabary consists of 85 characters representing different syllable sounds in the Cherokee language. It's elegant, efficient, and perfectly adapted to Cherokee phonology. Within 2 years of its introduction in 1821, Cherokee literacy rates skyrocketed past most white Georgia communities. Think about that for a moment: a people who had never had a writing system became more literate than their supposedly civilized neighbors in less time than it takes most American kids to learn cursive. But Sequoyah wasn't just a brilliant inventor, he was a political visionary who understood that literacy was power. He saw that Cherokee dependence on English-speaking interpreters and English-language documents weakened Cherokee sovereignty. By giving Cherokee people the ability to read and write in their own language, he was giving them the tools for political and cultural independence. The Cherokee Phoenix, established in 1828, was printed in both Cherokee and English, making it accessible to both Cherokee citizens and white Americans. This wasn't just a tribal newsletter, it was a sophisticated newspaper that covered international affairs, constitutional law, tribal politics, scientific discoveries, and the growing threats from white settlers. Imagine opening your morning paper and reading editorial analysis of European politics, written by people your government classified as uncivilized savages. The Phoenix published Cherokee laws, constitutional amendments, Supreme Court decisions, and congressional debates. It reported on Cherokee business successes, educational achievements, and cultural developments. It also documented the increasing pressure from Georgia politicians and white settlers who wanted Cherokee land and were growing frustrated with Cherokee resistance to removal. But here's the part that really pissed off white America. The Cherokee weren't just politically sophisticated, they were economically successful, socially stable, and culturally vibrant. They were beating white Americans at their own game while maintaining their distinct Cherokee identity. Chief John Ross lived in a mansion at the head of the Coosa River that would make plantation owners jealous. 2 stories, glass windows, imported furniture, landscaped gardens, and a library filled with books in Cherokee English, Latin, and Greek. He spoke perfect English, had been educated by white tutors, understood American law better than most American lawyers, and could navigate the complex worlds of Cherokee and American politics with equal skill. But Ross wasn't an assimilated individual who had abandoned Cherokee culture. He was a Cherokee patriot who had mastered American culture, the better to defend Cherokee sovereignty. He participated in traditional Cherokee ceremonies, spoke Cherokee fluently, and understood that Cherokee survival depended on adapting to changing circumstances without surrendering Cherokee identity. Cherokee businesses were thriving across the Cherokee Nation. Joseph Vann owned a steamboat called the Lucy Walker and operated the largest plantation in the Cherokee Nation with over 800 acres under cultivation and more than 100 enslaved workers. His house, called Diamond Hill, featured imported wallpaper, crystal chandeliers, and furniture shipped from New York. Major Ridge was a successful entrepreneur whose home featured a large library and hosted dinner parties that attracted white visitors from across the South. Some Cherokee families owned enslaved people. Yes, it's complicated and uncomfortable, but that's how successfully they'd adapted to and mastered the American economic system. Cherokee slaveholding wasn't identical to white slaveholding. Cherokee law provided more protections for enslaved people. Cherokee masters were more likely to free enslaved workers, and Cherokee society was more accepting of racial mixing, but it was still slavery, and it represented the Cherokee adaptation to an economic system that was both profitable and morally compromised. This reality complicates the simple narratives we usually tell about Cherokee history. The Cherokee weren't just innocent victims of white aggression, they were active participants in American economic and political life, who made strategic choices about how to survive and thrive in a changing world. Some of those choices, like slaveholding, were morally questionable. Others, like constitutional government and public education, were admirable. Most were simply pragmatic responses to difficult circumstances. The Cherokee had their own postal system that connected Cherokee communities across hundreds of miles of territory. They had their own police force that maintained order and enforced Cherokee law. They had their own court system that tried both civil and criminal cases according to Cherokee legal traditions adapted for modern circumstances. They had their own schools where Cherokee children learned to read and write in both Cherokee and English, often achieving higher literacy rates than white children in neighboring states. Cherokee society was remarkably stable and prosperous. Crime rates were low, educational achievement was high, economic development was rapid, and political participation was widespread. Cherokee communities were healthier, more peaceful, and more economically dynamic than most white communities in the region. And that was the problem. Every Cherokee success made Indian removal harder to justify. How do you claim you're bringing civilization to savages when the savages have better schools than you do? How do you argue that Indians can't govern themselves when the Cherokee government is more stable, more democratic, and less corrupt than most state governments? How do you justify taking Indian land to promote progress when Indians are already making their land more productive than most white farmers? The Cherokee were inconvenient. Their success was a direct challenge to the racial ideologies that justified white supremacy and manifest destiny. So that success had to be destroyed, and the memory of that success had to be erased. Then came 1829, and someone found gold in Cherokee territory. Not just a little gold, enough gold to drive grown men insane and make them forget every principle they claim to hold dear. Enough gold to turn neighbors into enemies, Christians into murderers, and a constitutional republic into a criminal conspiracy. Imagine your quiet neighbor wins the lottery and suddenly everyone on your block is planning to rob them. That's exactly what happened, except the neighbors were the state of Georgia, thousands of gold-hungry settlers, and ultimately the federal government of the United States. Cherokee sovereignty, Cherokee rights, Cherokee lives all became expendable in the face of white greed for Cherokee gold. The Dahlonega gold rush turned Cherokee territory into a free-for-all. White prospectors swarmed into Cherokee lands like locusts, setting up illegal camps claiming Cherokee property and demanding that the federal government make their theft legal. These weren't just random adventurers seeking their fortune. These were organized groups backed by Georgia politicians who saw an opportunity to finally solve the Cherokee problem once and for all. White settlers built makeshift towns on Cherokee land, established mining operations without Cherokee permission, and treated Cherokee property as if it belonged to them. When Cherokee authorities tried to enforce Cherokee law and remove the trespassers, Georgia politicians screamed about Cherokee aggression against innocent American citizens. Governor George Gilmer announced that Cherokee territory belonged to Georgia, and that Cherokee people had no rights that white Georgians were bound to respect. It was a direct repudiation of every treaty the United States had signed with the Cherokee Nation, a complete rejection of federal authority over Indian affairs, and a bold declaration that Georgia intended to take Cherokee land regardless of law, justice, or constitutional government. Georgia passed a series of laws declaring Cherokee government, illegal Cherokee courts invalid, and Cherokee territory open for white settlement. Think about that for a moment, a state government declaring another government illegal on its own territory. It's like Texas deciding Oklahoma doesn't get to exist anymore because Texans want Oklahoma's oil resources. The Georgia laws prohibited Cherokee courts from trying white defendants, made Cherokee testimony inadmissible, and white courts declared all Cherokee laws null and void, and authorized Georgia officials to arrest Cherokee leaders for the crime of governing their own people. It was legal warfare designed to destroy Cherokee sovereignty and justify Cherokee dispossession. But here's where the Cherokee showed. They understood America better than America understood itself. Instead of responding with violence, they responded with lawyers. Instead of taking up arms, they took up law books. Instead of fighting a war they couldn't win, they fought a legal battle they should have won. Cherokee Nation vs. Georgia and Worcester vs. Georgia went straight to the Supreme Court, and the Cherokee hired the best constitutional lawyers in America. Men like William Wirt, former Attorney General of the United States, who understood federal law, constitutional principles, and treaty obligations better than anyone in the country. The legal arguments were straightforward. The United States had signed treaties with the Cherokee Nation, recognizing Cherokee sovereignty. The Constitution gave Congress, not individual states, authority over Indian affairs. Georgia had no legal right to extend its laws over Cherokee territory or to nullify Cherokee government. In Worcester versus Georgia, the Cherokee won a complete victory. Chief Justice John Marshall's decision was a thorough vindication of Cherokee rights and a complete repudiation of Georgia's land grab. The court ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct community with exclusive jurisdiction over its own territory, that Georgia's laws were unconstitutional, and that Cherokee sovereignty was real and legally protected. The Cherokee Nation, then, is a distinct community occupying its own territory, with boundaries accurately described, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force. Marshall wrote, "It should have been the end of the story. Justice had spoken. The law was clear. The Constitution was on the Cherokee side, but President Andrew Jackson had other ideas. Jackson had built his political career on Indian removal, made his fortune speculating in Indian lands, and commanded troops in Indian wars. The idea that Indians could use white courts to protect themselves from white greed was personally offensive to him, so he simply refused to enforce the Supreme Court's decision." The quote attributed to Jackson, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it," may be apocryphal, but it perfectly captures his response. It was the 19th century equivalent of a mob boss telling a judge to go screw himself, except the mob boss was the President of the United States, and the judge was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Jackson's refusal to enforce the Worcester decision created a constitutional crisis that revealed the fundamental weakness of American democracy. What happens when the most powerful person in the country simply ignores the law? What happens when justice depends on the goodwill of the people? Justice is supposed to constrain. What happens when the executive branch decides that constitutional government is just a suggestion? The Cherokee had proved that they could beat white Americans in white courts using white law. They had demonstrated that justice was on their side, that law supported their position, that the Constitution protected their rights. And it didn't matter. Power trumped law, greed overcame justice, and racism defeated constitutionalism. What happened next should be required reading for anyone who still believes America always keeps its promises or that doing the right thing guarantees protection from injustice. The Treaty of New Echota was signed on December 29, 1835, by a handful of Cherokee who had zero authority to speak for their nation. Major Ridge, his son John, Ridge Elias Boudinot, and a few other Cherokee leaders, men who genuinely believed that removal was inevitable, and that negotiating the best possible terms was better than resisting and losing everything. But they were a tiny minority acting without authorization from the Cherokee government. The Cherokee Constitution required any land cession to be approved by the Cherokee National Council, and the National Council had explicitly, repeatedly, overwhelmingly rejected removal. The treaty signers were committing treason under Cherokee law, and they knew it. Imagine if 5 random people from your neighborhood sold your house to the city without your permission, and the government said, "Sounds legit, pack your bags." That's literally what happened. The overwhelming majority of Cherokee people led by Principal Chief John Ross rejected this fraudulent treaty. They didn't just disagree with it, they considered it treason. John Ross and 16,000 Cherokee signed a petition to Congress declaring the Treaty of New Echota null and void. 16,000 people, nearly the entire Cherokee population, formally protesting a treaty signed by fewer than 20 individuals. They pointed out that Cherokee law required any land cession to be approved by the Cherokee National Council, and the National Council had explicitly rejected removal. Cherokee delegations traveled to Washington multiple times, meeting with congressmen, testifying before committees, making legal arguments based on constitutional law and treaty obligations. They hired lobbyists, they wrote newspaper articles, they appealed to religious organizations and humanitarian groups. They did everything the American system said they should do to seek redress of grievances. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote to President Martin Van Buren, "The soul of man, the justice, the mercy that is the heart's heart in all men from Maine to Georgia, does abhor this business. A crime is projected that confounds our understandings by its magnitude, a crime that really deprives us as well as the Cherokees of a country. For how could we call the conspiracy that should crush these poor Indians our government, or the land that was cursed by their parting and their dying groans our country anymore?" Van Buren ignored him, Congress ignored the Cherokee protests, the President ignored the Supreme Court. The entire American system ignored its own laws, its own constitution, its own proclaimed values in order to steal Cherokee land for white settlers who wanted Cherokee gold. The Senate ratified the Treaty of New Echota by a single vote, 31 to 30. One vote. The entire Cherokee nation was condemned to exile by the margin of one senator who probably never set foot in Cherokee territory, and certainly never consulted Cherokee people about their desires. The Trail of Tears wasn't just a forced march, it was the murder of the American promise. The Cherokee had done everything right. They had outgoverned the governors, out-civilized the civilizers, out-lawyered the lawyers, and even won in the highest court in the land. But when white men wanted Cherokee gold, none of that mattered. Imagine being John Ross in the spring of 1838, watching federal troops surround your home. You're the democratically elected leader of a sovereign nation that has a written constitution, a functioning government, and legal recognition from the United States Supreme Court. You've spent decades working within the American system, believing in American justice, trusting American promises. You've seen your people adopt American institutions while maintaining Cherokee identity. Cherokee families have joined Christian churches. Cherokee children have learned English. Cherokee entrepreneurs have built successful businesses using American economic principles. You've created a government that was more democratic, more just, and more stable than most white governments. You've proved that Cherokee people could be civilized according to white standards while remaining proudly Cherokee. You've demonstrated that assimilation and cultural preservation could coexist. You've shown that indigenous peoples could adapt to changing circumstances without surrendering their essential identity. And now soldiers are loading your people into wagons like livestock, destroying everything your nation has built, scattering your families across a continent because white men found gold in Cherokee mountains. General Winfield Scott's troops built stockades, essentially concentration camps, to hold Cherokee families while they prepared for removal. Men, women, and children were rounded up from their homes, their farms, their businesses, and herded into these camps with whatever they could carry. White Georgia settlers followed behind the soldiers like vultures, looting Cherokee homes, stealing Cherokee property, claiming Cherokee land before the families were even out of sight. The cruelty was both systematic and casual. Families were separated during the roundup with no effort made to keep relatives together. Elderly people were forced from their deathbeds. Pregnant women gave birth in the stockades. Children watched soldiers destroy their toys, their pets, their entire world. Cherokee families had to abandon houses they had built with their own hands, farms they had cultivated for generations, businesses they had spent decades developing. The Cherokee National Treasury, Cherokee Phoenix, printing press, Cherokee government documents, all were seized or destroyed. It wasn't just individual dispossession, it was the systematic destruction of an entire civilization. The journey west took months and covered nearly 1,000 miles of difficult terrain in the worst weather conditions imaginable. 16,000 Cherokee were forced from their home. 4,000 died on the way from disease, from exposure, from heartbreak, from the simple fact that human beings aren't meant to be uprooted from their ancestral homes and marched across a continent like cattle. But the numbers don't capture the full horror or the complete scope of the betrayal. Families were separated permanently. Children watched their parents die and were buried in unmarked graves along the trail. Elders who had never been outside Cherokee territory found themselves dying in foreign lands, unable to return to the sacred sites where their ancestors were buried. Pregnant women gave birth on the roadside without medical care. The sick and weak were left behind to die when they couldn't keep up with the forced march. Soldiers stole Cherokee possessions and sold them for personal profit. Food supplies were inadequate, medical care was non-existent, and shelter was insufficient for the weather conditions. Think about what it means to lose everything. Not just your house, not just your possessions, but your entire world. The graves of your ancestors that you can no longer visit or tend. The sacred sites where your people had prayed for generations. The rivers where your children learned to swim. The forests where your fathers hunted. The meadows where your mothers gathered medicine. The Cherokee didn't just lose property, they lost the physical connection to their spiritual and cultural identity. Cherokee families had lived in the same areas for generations, developing intimate knowledge of local ecosystems, weather patterns, seasonal cycles, and natural resources. They knew which plants to gather for medicine, where to find the best clay for pottery, when the fish would run in specific rivers. This knowledge, accumulated over centuries, was suddenly useless in the unfamiliar landscape of Oklahoma. Traditional Cherokee society was organized around specific places, sacred sites, burial grounds, ceremonial areas that were integral to Cherokee religious and cultural life. Removal didn't just relocate Cherokee people, it severed their connection to the spiritual landscape that gave meaning to Cherokee identity. And for what, so white settlers could dig holes in Cherokee mountains looking for gold that most of them never found. So Georgia politicians could distribute Cherokee land to their supporters and cronies. So America could prove that might makes right, that promises are meaningless when they conflict with profit, that justice is just a word that powerful people use when it serves their interests. Cherokee lives were destroyed so that white men could get rich. Cherokee children died so that white children could inherit stolen land. Cherokee dreams were crushed so that white dreams could flourish on the graves of Cherokee civilization. The Trail of Tears proved that in America, doing everything right doesn't protect you from people who want what you have. It proved that law is meaningless when power decides to ignore it. It proved that American promises are worth exactly as much as American power wants them to be worth at any given moment. But the Cherokee people survived. In Oklahoma, they rebuilt their nation, reestablished their government, and preserved their culture despite everything the United States had done to destroy them. Cherokee language, Cherokee traditions, Cherokee identity survived removal, allotment, boarding schools, and a century of policies designed to eliminate Cherokee distinctiveness. Today, the Cherokee Nation is the largest tribal government in the United States, with more than 300,000 citizens and a sophisticated government that provides services, creates economic opportunities, and preserves Cherokee culture for future generations. Cherokee people have become doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists, politicians, and business leaders while maintaining their identity as Cherokee citizens. The Cherokee survival is a testament to the resilience of indigenous peoples and the power of cultural identity to resist even the most determined efforts at destruction. But Cherokee survival doesn't justify what was done to them, doesn't minimize the magnitude of the crime, and doesn't excuse the betrayal of American principles that made removal possible. The Cherokee had believed in America, more than America believed in itself. They had trusted a system that promised justice and received genocide instead. Their story is a reminder that American democracy has always been incomplete, that American justice has always been conditional, and that American promises have always been subject to American power. Think about that the next time someone tells you America has always been the land of the free. Let me paint you a picture of 1921 Tulsa that will make your jaw drop and then make you furious about everything you weren't taught in school. Greenwood District wasn't just a neighborhood, it was an economic empire that made white Tulsa look broke in comparison. We're talking about 35 city blocks of black-owned businesses, black professionals, black wealth, and black independence that challenged everything white supremacy taught about racial hierarchy. Picture yourself walking down Greenwood Avenue on a Saturday evening in 1920. The street pulses with prosperity and possibility. Well-dressed families in their finest clothes stroll past the Dreamland Theater, which seats 750 people and shows the latest Hollywood films before many white theaters get them. The Gurley Hotel rises 3 stories above the street, its windows glowing with electric light, its lobby filled with traveling businessmen, visiting professionals, and local entrepreneurs conducting deals that would make Wall Street financiers jealous. The smell of barbecue drifts from Williams' confectionery, mixing with the scent of hair pomade from the numerous beauty salons and the sound of jazz music spilling out of the clubs and theaters that line the district. You hear the clink of glasses from the elegant restaurants, the murmur of serious conversations from the professional offices, the laughter of children playing in the parks and swimming in the public pool. This isn't just prosperity, this is sovereignty. This is what happens when a community controls its own economic destiny. When black dollars circulate in black hands, when black talent nurtures black success. This is what white supremacists feared, most proof that black people didn't need white people to thrive. Dr. A.C. Jackson wasn't just a good doctor, he was so skilled that white doctors across Oklahoma sent their most difficult cases to him. The Mayo Brothers, founders of the Mayo Clinic, called him the most able Negro surgeon in America. But Jackson wasn't unique in Greenwood, he was typical. The district had its own hospital, with black doctors and nurses, its own medical professionals who had trained at the best schools in the country, its own lawyers who had passed state bar examinations, its own dentists, teachers, and professionals who served a community that valued education, achievement, and excellence. O.W. Gurley had arrived in Tulsa in 1906 with $37 in his pocket and a vision of black economic independence. By 1921, he owned so much real estate they called him the Black Oil King. His properties generated rental income that would make modern real estate developers weep with envy. J.B. Stratford's hotel was 3 stories tall, with 54 rooms, hot and cold, running water, and its own telephone system. It was nicer than most white hotels in Oklahoma and attracted black travelers from across the country. But here's the statistic that really tells the story and explains why Greenwood had to be destroyed. Money circulated in Greenwood an average of 19 times before leaving the district. 19 times. To understand how revolutionary this was, consider that modern American communities are lucky if money changes hands twice before disappearing into corporate chains and distant shareholders. Greenwood had created a closed-loop economy that generated wealth like a machine, keeping dollars in the community building. Generational wealth, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem of black prosperity that proved black people didn't need white permission to succeed. When a black family spent money at a black grocery store, that money stayed in Greenwood. The grocer used it to buy supplies from black wholesalers, who used it to pay black employees who used it to buy goods from other black businesses. Compare that to today, where money spent in black communities typically leaves within hours, flowing to suburban malls, corporate headquarters, and white-owned businesses. Greenwood had solved the economic problem that still plagues black communities a century later: how to keep black wealth in black hands long enough to create more black wealth. The Greenwood Business Directory read like a who's who of black entrepreneurship. There were 2 newspapers, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun. There were multiple banks, including Byland's National Bank and the Savings and Loan Association. There were insurance companies, law firms, medical practices, dental offices, pharmacies, grocery stores, restaurants, hotels, theaters, barbershops, beauty salons, and every other type of business you'd find in any prosperous American community. But these weren't just businesses, they were institutions that created opportunities for black advancement. The banks provided loans for black homebuyers and black entrepreneurs when white banks wouldn't. The newspapers celebrated black achievements and reported on black successes when white papers ignored them. The schools educated black children when white schools excluded them. The hospitals treated black patients when white hospitals turned them away. How did they do it? How did a community of people, barely 2 generations removed from slavery, create an economic powerhouse that rivaled anything in white America? The answer reveals both the possibilities and the limitations of separate but equal America. First, they had no choice but to build their own everything. Jim Crow laws and white racism forced black Tulsans to create parallel institutions. When white banks wouldn't serve them, they created their own banks. When white schools excluded their children, they built their own schools. When white hospitals turned them away, they trained their own doctors and built their own hospitals. When white businesses refused to serve them, they started their own businesses. Segregation was supposed to keep black people down, but in Greenwood it had the opposite effect. Instead of begging for white acceptance, black Tulsans built their own independence. Instead of depending on white institutions that didn't want them, they created black institutions that were often superior to their white counterparts. Second, they understood that economic cooperation was survival. The African tradition of collective economic support merged with American entrepreneurial spirit to create something unprecedented. Black families invested in each other's businesses. Black professionals mentored young black entrepreneurs. Black consumers consciously supported black businesses, understanding that every dollar spent in Greenwood strengthened the entire community. The Greenwood business community operated like an extended family. Successful entrepreneurs helped fund new businesses. Established professionals provided advice and connections to young people starting their careers. Everyone understood that individual success depended on community prosperity, that lifting yourself up meant lifting your neighbors up too. Third, they were geographically concentrated in a way that maximized economic impact. Unlike modern American cities, where successful black families often moved to suburban areas, taking their wealth and purchasing power with them, Greenwood's prosperity was concentrated in a small area. This created network effects. Successful people lived near each other, worked together, invested together, built together. Wealth generated more wealth opportunity, created more opportunity success, bred more success. Fourth, they controlled their own narrative and celebrated their own achievements. The Tulsa Star newspaper was black-owned and black-operated, reporting on black achievements, promoting black businesses, celebrating black success stories. Instead of consuming media that told them they were inferior, Greenwood residents read news that reflected their reality. They were thriving, succeeding, building something extraordinary. But the most important factor was land ownership. Many Greenwood families owned their homes, their businesses, their property. This wasn't just about building wealth, it was about building power. Property ownership meant political participation, economic independence, and generational wealth transfer. Home ownership rates in Greenwood were higher than in many white communities of the same era. Imagine your neighbors becoming millionaires while following all the same rules you were, except they're doing it better, faster, and with more style. Now imagine you've been told your entire life that these neighbors are inherently inferior, biologically incapable of success, naturally suited only for manual labor and subservience. The cognitive dissonance would drive you insane. That's exactly what happened in Tulsa. Greenwood's prosperity was a direct, daily, undeniable challenge to everything white supremacy taught. How could black people be inferior if they were out-succeeding white people at capitalism itself? How could segregation be justified if separate institutions were producing superior results? How could white people claim natural superiority when black people were demonstrating superior achievement? White Tulsa across the railroad tracks watched Greenwood's success with growing rage that mixed disbelief, envy, and existential terror. The sight of black families in expensive cars, black children in fine clothes, black professionals in elegant offices, black entrepreneurs running successful businesses, it was all wrong according to the racial order that white supremacy demanded. The white press regularly published articles expressing astonishment at black prosperity as if black success was somehow unnatural or inexplicable. The Tulsa Tribune described Greenwood as a Negro metropolis and seemed unable to comprehend how formerly enslaved people and their children had created such wealth in just a few decades. White politicians complained that black voters were becoming too influential in local elections, that black businesses were competing too effectively with white businesses, that black success was somehow unfair to white people who expected racial privileges to guarantee them economic advantages. Think about that twisted logic. White people were angry that black people were succeeding in the American system. They were offended by black prosperity, threatened by black achievement, enraged by black independence. Greenwood's very existence was a threat to everything white Tulsa believed about racial hierarchy, natural superiority, and white destiny. The jealousy wasn't just economic, it was existential. If black people could create wealth, govern themselves, and build successful communities without white oversight or assistance, what was the justification for white supremacy? If separate really could be equal, or in Greenwood's case, superior, Then what was the argument for white domination? Greenwood had to be destroyed, not because it was failing, but because it was succeeding too well. Black prosperity was a direct threat to white supremacy, and white supremacy couldn't tolerate such a threat. May 31st, 1921, Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black teenager who shined shoes for a living, gets on an elevator in the Drexel Building in downtown Tulsa. Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white girl, operates the elevator. Something happens. Probably Rowland steps on Page's foot or accidentally bumps into her when the elevator lurches. She screams. He runs. In any rational society, this would be a minor incident worth maybe a brief apology and immediate forgetting. In 1921 Tulsa, it became the excuse white supremacists had been waiting for to destroy the most prosperous black community in America. The Tulsa Tribune, a newspaper with a circulation of about 50,000 and a reputation for inflammatory coverage of racial issues, ran the story with the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." Without investigation, without evidence, without even talking to Sarah Page about what actually happened, the Tribune turned a stumble into an assault, an accident into an attempted rape, a misunderstanding into a justification for murder. The Tribune's afternoon edition reportedly included an editorial titled, "To Lynch Negro Tonight," though copies of that edition mysteriously disappeared from the historical record, and the Tribune later denied publishing such an editorial. Whether the editorial existed or not, the message was clear: Dick Rowland was going to die and white Tulsa was going to kill him. Facts didn't matter. Due process didn't matter. The presumption of innocence didn't matter. The Tribune had set the narrative: a black man had attacked a white woman, and every white person in Tulsa knew exactly what that meant in the code of white supremacy. It meant lynch law. It meant rope and fire. It meant the ritual murder of a black man to remind all black people of their place in the racial hierarchy. By evening, a white mob had gathered at the courthouse where Rowland was being held in protective custody. They came armed with guns, knives, ropes, and gasoline. They came angry, drunk on whiskey and racial hatred, ready for blood. They chanted for Rowland to be handed over for lynching. They threatened to storm the courthouse and take him by force. Sheriff Willard McCullough, to his credit, refused to hand Rowland over to the mob. He positioned deputies around the courthouse and declared that no lynching would happen on his watch. But he was one man with a few deputies facing hundreds of armed white men who had come to commit murder. When a group of black World War I veterans, men who had fought for democracy in France, only to come home to this, showed up to protect Rowland from lynching, the powder keg that was racial Tulsa finally exploded. What happened next wasn't a riot. It was a military operation designed to eliminate black prosperity through systematic violence. White Tulsa didn't just attack Greenwood randomly. They organized, planned, and executed the destruction of an entire community with military precision and coordinated efficiency. The black veterans who had come to the courthouse weren't looking for trouble. They were trying to prevent a lynching. These were men who had served their country in World War I, who had faced German machine guns and survived mustard gas attacks, who had fought for democracy abroad and returned home expecting to enjoy democracy at home. When they offered to help Sheriff McCullough guard the jail, he told them it wasn't necessary, that he had the situation under control. As they prepared to leave, a white man approached one of the black veterans and demanded that he hand over his gun. The veteran refused. The white man tried to take the gun by force. Someone fired a shot. Whose gun, whose finger, whose decision, nobody knows. But that bullet started the worst act of domestic terrorism in American history. Picture yourself in Greenwood at midnight on May 31st, 1921. You're awakened by the sound of gunfire in the distance, growing closer and louder. You look out your window and see flames rising from the business district. The smell of smoke fills your nostrils, making your eyes water and your throat burn. You hear the sound of breaking glass, shouting voices, automobile engines racing through the streets. Then you hear something that makes your blood run cold, the sound of airplane engines overhead. Not one plane, but several circling like vultures over your community. Yes, airplanes, dropping incendiary bombs on American citizens, in an American city. This isn't some third world conflict or foreign war zone. This is Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. Private planes hired by white mobs to rain fire on black families whose only crime was being too successful, too independent, too prosperous for white supremacy to tolerate. The pilots weren't random vigilantes. They were trained aviators, many of them, World War I veterans who had learned to fly fighting Germans in Europe, and were now using those skills to bomb American civilians whose tax dollars had paid for their training. They were dropping makeshift incendiary devices, bottles filled with gasoline and turpentine, designed to start fires that would spread quickly through the wooden buildings of Greenwood. The planes weren't just bombing randomly. They were targeting specific buildings that represented black institutional power and economic independence. The newspaper office, the hospital, The schools, the banks, the most successful businesses. They were trying to destroy not just Greenwood's physical infrastructure, but its institutional infrastructure, the buildings that represented black self-determination and autonomy. On the ground, white rioters moved through Greenwood with devastating efficiency and organizational sophistication. This wasn't random violence or spontaneous destruction, it was a coordinated military operation designed to eliminate black economic power through systematic annihilation. White attackers were organized into groups with specific assignments. Some groups were responsible for forcing black families from their homes at gunpoint. Others were tasked with looting valuable property before the buildings were destroyed. Still others were assigned to burn specific blocks or neighborhoods. The destruction followed a pattern that suggests advanced planning and coordination. The Tulsa police didn't protect Greenwood, they actively participated in its destruction. Police officers deputized white rioters, turning lynch mob members into legal authorities with official power to arrest, detain, and kill. They provided weapons and ammunition to white civilians, distributing guns from police armories to anyone who wanted to join the attack on Greenwood. Some police officers were photographed loading stolen goods from black homes into police vehicles. Others were seen leading groups of white rioters through Greenwood, pointing out the most valuable properties and the most successful businesses. The police force that was supposed to protect all citizens of Tulsa instead became an armed wing of the white supremacist mob. The fire department was ordered not to respond to calls from Greenwood. When black residents tried to fight the fires themselves, white rioters cut their water hoses and threatened to shoot anyone who tried to save black property. Fire trucks that tried to enter Greenwood were turned back by armed white guards who declared that black property wasn't worth saving. Machine guns mounted on trucks patrolled the streets of Greenwood, mowing down anyone who tried to escape or fight back. White rioters set up roadblocks at every exit from the district, trapping families inside the burning neighborhood like animals in a cage. Snipers positioned themselves on rooftops and in windows, shooting at black people who appeared in doorways or windows. The National Guard, when they finally arrived the next morning, didn't stop the violence, they helped complete the destruction. Instead of arresting white rioters, they rounded up black survivors and marched them to internment camps at the fairgrounds and convention center. Black Tulsans who had lost everything were then imprisoned like criminals, forced to carry identification cards and released only when white employers vouched for their good character. For 18 hours, the most prosperous black community in America burned while authorities watched, participated, and prevented any effective resistance. When the smoke cleared on June 1st, 35 city blocks had been leveled. Over 1,400 homes and businesses destroyed. Churches that had taken decades to build were ash. Schools where black children had learned to read were rubble. Hospitals where black doctors had saved lives were gone. The newspaper office where black journalists had reported black success was a charred ruin. But the numbers don't capture the full scope of the destruction or the true magnitude of the crime. This wasn't just property damage. This was the systematic elimination of generational wealth, the deliberate destruction of black economic independence, the calculated annihilation of black institutional power. Families that had spent decades building businesses saw them destroyed in hours. Property that represented life savings, retirement security, and inheritance for children was gone forever. The Dreamland Theater, which had cost thousands of dollars to build and equip, was reduced to twisted metal and ash. The Gurley Hotel, which had been a symbol of black hospitality and success, was a smoking ruin. Dr. A.C. Jackson, the renowned surgeon, was shot and killed in front of his home as he tried to surrender to white authorities. Dozens of other professionals, business owners, and community leaders were murdered. The human capital that had built Greenwood, the knowledge, experience, relationships, and leadership that made the community possible, was deliberately targeted for destruction. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, declaring the destruction an insurrection not covered by policies. Think about that for a moment. Insurance companies that had gladly collected premiums from black policyholders for years suddenly decided that racial violence was an act of war that voided their obligations. Black families who had paid insurance premiums faithfully for years discovered that their policies were worthless when they needed them most. The city of Tulsa changed building codes to prevent black families from rebuilding, requiring expensive brick construction that most couldn't afford. When some families did manage to rebuild, despite the obstacles, the city used eminent domain to seize their land for urban renewal projects. Every legal mechanism available was used to ensure that Greenwood could never rise again. Here's the most mind-blowing part of the entire story. For 75 years, the Tulsa Race Massacre never happened. Not officially, not in textbooks, not in local newspapers, not in family conversations. An entire city conspired to pretend that the worst act of racial violence in American history simply never occurred. Newspapers destroyed their archives, police reports vanished, school textbooks ignored it completely. Local historians wrote books about Tulsa history that somehow forgot to mention the destruction of 35 city blocks and the murder of hundreds of people. It was a conspiracy of silence so complete, so systematic, so successful that it would have made totalitarian regimes jealous. The Tulsa Race Massacre was erased so thoroughly from public memory that many survivors' own children didn't know the full story. Families that had lost everything were told to forget, to move on, to not burden their children with the pain of the past. The trauma was buried along with the truth, creating a wound that couldn't heal because it couldn't be acknowledged. Survivors who tried to tell their stories were discouraged, ignored, or threatened. White Tulsa didn't want to hear about its crimes, and Black Tulsa was told that dwelling on the past was counterproductive. The few historians who tried to research the massacre found that documents had been destroyed, witnesses had been silenced, and official records had been sanitized. It wasn't until the 1990s that Tulsa finally began to acknowledge what had happened. The Oklahoma legislature created a commission to investigate the massacre, and survivors in their 90s finally had their stories officially recognized. The conspiracy of silence was finally broken, but not before it had done its work. Erasing a community, erasing a story, erasing a truth that was too ugly for white America to face. The massacre didn't just destroy buildings, it destroyed the model of Black prosperity that Greenwood represented. It sent a message to every Black community in America: succeed too much, and you'll be destroyed. Build too much wealth, and it will be taken. Become too independent, and you'll be reminded who really holds power. Greenwood families lost more than property. They lost the foundation for generational wealth that would have transformed Black economic prospects for decades. Children who should have inherited businesses and property instead inherited trauma and debt. Young people who should have had access to family wealth to fund their education or start their own businesses instead grew up in poverty. The economic impact rippled through generations. Families that had been middle class or wealthy were reduced to poverty overnight. The destruction of Black Wall Street eliminated a model of Black economic independence that took decades to recreate elsewhere. The loss of Greenwood's banks, businesses, and professional services left Black Tulsans dependent on white institutions that had excluded them before the massacre and continued to discriminate against them afterward. But perhaps the most devastating damage was to trust and hope. How do you trust a system that failed you so completely? How do you believe in justice when the people sworn to protect you are the ones holding the torches? How do you have faith in America when America showed you exactly what it thought of your success? The echo here is the sound of silence, a deafening silence that reminds us that history isn't just written by the winners, it's erased by the guilty. And that silence continues today in every attempt to minimize racial violence, in every effort to erase uncomfortable truths from textbooks, in every time people choose. Forgetting over justice, comfort over truth. Welcome to West Virginia, 1920, where coal companies had perfected a system of control so complete, so totalitarian, so thoroughly exploitative that it made actual slavery look like a part-time job with benefits. This wasn't just exploitation, this was total domination of human beings dressed up as free market capitalism and sold as American prosperity. Picture your life as a coal miner in Logan County. You wake up in a company house that you don't own on company land, that you can never buy in a company town, that exists solely to extract profit from your labor and your life. You eat company food, bought with company scrip at the company store, where prices are set to keep your family perpetually in debt to the company. You drink company water, breathe company air, thick with coal dust, and when you die from company negligence, you'll be buried in the company cemetery, while your family is evicted from the company house to make room for the next worker. Your children attend company schools where they learn company-approved lessons designed to make them grateful for the opportunity to work in company mines. Your wife shops at the company store where every purchase is recorded, every debt is tallied, every dollar you earn flows back into company coffers. You live in a corporate dictatorship that makes modern tech companies look like worker cooperatives. You can't leave because you owe the company money, and the company makes sure you always owe money. Every payday, you discover that your wages have been reduced by charges for housing, food equipment, medical care, and a dozen other fees that keep you trapped in permanent debt. You can't organize because company guards will beat you senseless, blacklist you from every mine in the region, or simply make you disappear. You can't vote freely because the company controls the ballot box, owns the sheriff, and has bought every judge and politician in the county. It was feudalism with coal dust and better bookkeeping, a system of control so comprehensive that medieval lords would have been jealous. Except medieval serfs could appeal to the king for justice, could flee to another lord's territory, could claim sanctuary in a church. Coal miners had nobody to appeal to. The companies owned everything and everyone who might offer help or protection. The company store wasn't just a business, it was a mechanism of control, a tool of oppression disguised as convenience and sold as progress. Coal companies paid workers in scrip, not cash. Scrip was company money that could only be spent at company stores on company goods, at company prices that were set to maximize company profits, while minimizing worker freedom. It was monopoly money, except the game never ended. The bank always won, and you could never pass go or collect $200. Scrip couldn't be used anywhere except company-owned businesses, so miners couldn't shop in town, couldn't comparison shop, couldn't escape the company's economic control, even for basic necessities. Company stores charged inflated prices for everything. A loaf of bread that cost 20 cents in town cost 40 cents at the company store. A pound of coffee that sold for 30 cents elsewhere was 60 cents if you bought it with scrip. But miners couldn't shop in town because they didn't have real money, only company currency that was worthless outside the company's economic ecosystem. The system was designed to ensure that workers never accumulated savings, never achieved financial independence, never escaped company control. Every payday brought new charges: rent for the company, house fees for company utilities, costs for company medical care, deductions for company equipment. Workers often discovered that they owed the company more than they had earned, that working harder just made them deeper in debt. The famous song lyric, "I owe my soul to the company store," wasn't metaphor, it was literal description of economic slavery. Miners worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, in conditions that would horrify modern safety inspectors, only to find themselves deeper in debt every payday. The harder they worked, the more they owed. The more coal they produced, the poorer they became. Families were evicted from company housing if workers tried to organize or complain about conditions. Children were thrown out of company schools for their parents' disloyalty. Wives were barred from company stores if their husbands joined unions. Entire families could be rendered homeless and destitute for the crime of asking for basic worker rights or decent working conditions. When miners tried to organize for better conditions, fair wages, or basic safety protections, coal companies unleashed the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency corporate thugs with badges who made the notorious Pinkertons look like mall security guards. These weren't private investigators or even security guards in any conventional sense. They were mercenaries, private military contractors who specialized in breaking strikes, infiltrating unions, and murdering organizers with complete legal immunity. The Baldwin Felts agents operated like an occupying army throughout southern West Virginia. They carried military weapons, including machine guns and rifles. They drove armored vehicles that looked like tanks. They built fortified compounds that looked like military bases. They answered to no civil authority except the coal companies that paid their salaries and gave them their orders. Albert Felts and Lee Felts, the brothers who ran the agency, boasted that they could break any strike, destroy any union, and eliminate any troublemaker. They had unlimited resources provided by coal companies that generated millions in profits while paying workers starvation wages. They had military training, superior weapons, and the backing of local law enforcement that was either bought, intimidated, or controlled by the same companies. Baldwin Felts agents infiltrated union meetings, reporting on organizers and identifying leaders for elimination. They evicted union families from company housing at gunpoint, throwing women and children into the street regardless of weather or circumstances. They beat workers who attended union meetings, blacklisted activists from employment, and murdered organizers who couldn't be stopped through intimidation. The agents operated with complete impunity because they had been deputized by county sheriffs who were either on the company payroll or too intimidated to oppose them. They could arrest miners without warrants, search houses without permission, seize property without justification, and kill workers without consequences. They were the law in coal country, and the law served only corporate interests. But they had one crucial weakness: they underestimated the fighting spirit of men who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from resistance. And they made the fatal mistake of challenging a small-town police chief named Sid Hatfield, who wasn't afraid of private armies, corporate power, or armed thugs who thought badges made them untouchable. May 19, 1920, Matewan, West Virginia. It's a date that should be as famous as July 4th or December 7th, a moment that should be taught in every American history class, but most Americans have never heard of it because it doesn't fit the comfortable narrative of American freedom and progress. Baldwin Felts agents arrive in Matewan to evict union families from company housing. They have legal papers signed by company officials, company authorization to remove troublemakers, and enough firepower to level the entire town. They've done this hundreds of times before in dozens of coal camps across West Virginia. It should be routine: show up, throw families into the street, intimidate the locals, collect their pay, and move on to the next job. But Police Chief Sid Hatfield isn't having it, and that makes all the difference. Hatfield is a local boy who grew up poor in the West Virginia mountains, who knows what it's like to be pushed around by powerful men, who has sworn an oath to protect the people of Matawan, all the people including the miners that the coal companies want to crush. Hatfield understands something that the Baldwin Felts agents don't, that there's a difference between law and justice, between legal authority and moral legitimacy. The company may have legal papers, but the miners are his neighbors. The agents may have badges, but they're outsiders. The coal companies may have money, but they don't have the right to destroy people's lives for profit. When the Baldwin Felts agents start evicting union families, throwing furniture into the street, and forcing women and children from their homes, Hatfield tells them to stop. When they show him their company papers and claim legal authority, he shows them his badge and reminds them that they're in his town under his jurisdiction. When they threaten to arrest him for interfering with legal evictions, he tells them to try it. The confrontation escalates quickly. Agents and miners face off on Main Street, hands on guns, voices raised, tension crackling like electricity before a thunderstorm. Someone draws a weapon, someone else responds, and suddenly the most important gunfight in American labor history erupts in broad daylight on a small town street. When the smoke clears, 7 Baldwin Felts agents are dead, including Albert and Lee Felts, themselves the brothers who had terrorized coal country for years, who had seemed untouchable and invincible. 2 miners and Mayor Cabell Testerman are also killed, but the symbolic victory belongs to the workers. The private army that had ruled through fear and violence has been defeated by local law enforcement and armed citizens defending their community. Sid Hatfield is still standing, and overnight he becomes a folk hero to every working man in America. His name spreads through coal camps, factory towns, and working-class neighborhoods across the country. Here was proof that corporate power could be challenged, that company thugs could be defeated, that working people could fight back and win. Here's where the story takes an interesting turn that reveals how language itself becomes a weapon in class warfare. Those red bandanas that the miners wore around their necks to identify each other during labor conflicts. That's where the term redneck really comes from. Not from sunburn, not from farming, not from any of the stereotypes that urban elites use to mock rural people from union solidarity and working class resistance to corporate oppression. The red bandanas served multiple crucial purposes during the labor wars of the early 1920s. They identified union supporters during battles, allowing miners to distinguish friends from enemies in the chaos of armed conflict. They showed solidarity with striking workers across the coal fields, creating a visual symbol of unity that transcended individual mines or companies. And they became symbols of working-class pride, declarations that miners weren't ashamed of their labor or their struggle for dignity. Wearing a red bandana was a declaration of war against the coal companies and everything they represented. It meant you were willing to fight for your rights, willing to risk your job and your life for dignity and justice. It meant you stood with your fellow workers against the bosses, that you understood the principle of solidarity: an injury to one is an injury to all. The coal companies and their allies in the press quickly turned redneck into an insult, trying to make working-class solidarity seem backward, ignorant, and shameful. They wanted to shame miners out of organizing, to make them embarrassed of their own resistance to exploitation. They painted rednecks as violent, stupid, and uncivilized, dangerous people who threatened social order and economic progress. But the miners wore the term proudly, understanding that their enemies' insults were actually compliments. They were rednecks, and rednecks didn't bow down to company bosses. Rednecks fought back against injustice. Rednecks stood together when times got tough. Rednecks knew that solidarity was survival, that individual resistance was futile, that collective action was the only path to dignity and justice. The transformation of redneck from a badge of honor to a class-based insult reveals how power shapes language, how the ruling class uses cultural stereotypes to divide working people, how symbols of resistance get turned into marks of shame. But understanding the true origin of the term helps us see through the propaganda and recognize the real enemy, not other working people, but the system that exploits all workers, regardless of their accent, education, or geography. The coal companies weren't done with Sid Hatfield. He'd become too dangerous, too inspirational, too effective at organizing resistance to corporate control. His victory at Matewan had inspired miners across the region to stand up for their rights. His example proved that corporate power could be challenged successfully. He had to be eliminated before his influence spread further. The companies couldn't kill Hatfield openly. He was too well known, too popular, too protected by public attention. but they could arrange for his murder under cover of legal proceedings, making it look like justice rather than assassination. August 1st, 1921, Sid Hatfield and his friend Ed Chambers arrive at the McDowell County Courthouse in Welch, West Virginia, to testify in a trial related to the Matewan shootout. They're unarmed, having been assured by their lawyers that weapons weren't necessary in a courthouse. They're under legal protection, confident that justice will prevail in an American courtroom. They believe in the system they've sworn to defend. As they climb the courthouse steps, Baldwin Felt's agents emerge from hiding and gun them down in broad daylight. They shoot Hatfield multiple times, then stand over his body and pump more bullets into his corpse to make sure he's dead. They kill Chambers for good measure, eliminating a witness and sending a message about the cost of supporting union organizers. Then they claim self-defense, arguing that they were protecting themselves against armed and dangerous criminals. No Baldwin Felt's agent is ever prosecuted for the murders. The local authorities, bought and paid for by coal money, accept the company version of events. The legal system that was supposed to protect all citizens instead protects only corporate interests. The assassination of Sid Hatfield was more than murder. It was a declaration of war against anyone who dared challenge corporate power. It proved that the legal system, law enforcement, and political institutions were all weapons in the hands of the coal companies. It demonstrated that justice was for sale to the highest bidder, that rights existed, only as long as they didn't threaten profits. That assassination was the spark that ignited the largest labor uprising in American history. Miners across southern West Virginia had watched the legal system protect corporate murderers while criminalizing working-class resistance. They'd seen justice perverted, law enforcement corrupted, and democracy destroyed by coal company money. They decided that if the system wouldn't protect them, they'd protect themselves. Within days of Hatfield's assassination, armed miners begin gathering in the mountains of southern West Virginia. They come from coal camps. Across the region, men who've worked together in the mines fought together against the companies and suffered together under corporate tyranny. They carry hunting rifles, shotguns, pistols, and the kind of righteous anger that comes from watching your heroes murdered by the people who are supposed to represent justice. By late August 1921, 10,000 miners have assembled near Charleston, West Virginia. 10,000 working men who've decided that enough is enough, that they're not going to be murdered and exploited and treated like slaves, while coal company executives get rich off their labor and their lives. 10,000 Americans who believe in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the principle that all men are created equal. They're not revolutionaries trying to overthrow the government or radicals seeking to destroy American institutions. They're patriots demanding that American promises be kept, that American rights be protected, that American justice apply to working people as well as wealthy corporations. They wear red bandanas and march under American flags because they see themselves as defenders of American values against corporate tyranny. Their target is Logan County, where anti-union Sheriff Don Chaffin has assembled his own army of 3,000 company guards, deputies, and strikebreakers. Chaffin's forces are equipped with machine guns, military rifles, World War I surplus artillery, and unlimited ammunition provided by the coal companies. They've been given orders to shoot any union organizer on sight and to prevent miners from entering Logan County by any means necessary. The irony is bitter and profound. Many of the miners marching toward Logan County are World War I veterans who'd fought for democracy in the trenches of France, only to come home and discover that democracy didn't exist in the coal fields of West Virginia. They'd faced German machine guns at Belleauwood, and now they were facing American machine guns in their own backyard. They'd fought to make the world safe for democracy, and found that their own country wasn't safe for workers who demanded basic rights. For 5 days in late August and early September 1921, Blair Mountain becomes a battlefield that rivals anything from the Civil War or World War I. Trenches are dug along the ridgelines, machine gun nests are established on strategic heights, artillery pieces surplus from the Great War are positioned to command key approaches. It's the largest armed conflict on American soil since Gettysburg, and it's happening in the mountains of West Virginia, while most of the country has no idea it's going on. Picture yourself on Blair Mountain during the battle. The sound of rifle fire echoes off the mountainsides like thunder in a canyon. The smell of gunpowder mixes with the scent of autumn leaves and coal smoke. You can hear the rat-a-tat-tat of machine guns in the distance, the whistle of artillery shells overhead, the shouts of men advancing through the underbrush toward enemy positions. This isn't some romantic Hollywood battle where heroes charge boldly toward victory with stirring music in the background. This is dirty, desperate, deadly fighting between Americans who should be working together, but instead are killing each other over the basic question of whether working people have rights in their own country. The miners fight with remarkable courage and determination, but they're outgunned, outmanned, and outmaneuvered by Chafin's forces. The company army has military equipment, unlimited ammunition, strategic positions, and air support. Yes, air support government planes dropping bombs on American workers fighting for American rights on American soil. Let that sink in for a moment. The same government that had sent these men to fight for democracy in Europe was now bombing them for demanding democracy at home. The same military that had praised their courage in foreign trenches was now using that military technology against them in American mountains. The miners have hunting rifles determination and the knowledge that they're fighting for their family's survival and their children's future. They're fighting against a system that treats them like disposable equipment, that values coal more than human life, that measures success by profit margins rather than human dignity. Government planes circle overhead, dropping bombs and strafing miners who are trying to advance up the mountain. Machine guns spray death from concealed positions. Artillery shells explode among groups of advancing workers, sending bodies and body parts flying through the trees. It's warfare as brutal and technologically advanced as anything happening in Europe, except it's Americans killing Americans over workers' rights. On September 2, 1921, President Warren G. Harding finally intervenes, sending 2,500 federal troops to stop the fighting. The miners face an impossible choice: fire on the United States Army, or surrender their cause to federal authority. They choose surrender, but not because they're defeated, because they're patriots who won't shoot American soldiers even when those soldiers are protecting their oppressors. When the miners see American troops approaching under the American flag, they lay down their weapons and surrender without resistance. As one miner puts it, "We're not fighting our own soldiers. We're Americans, and we won't shoot American troops even if they're here to stop us from getting our rights." That decision, choosing patriotism over revolution, love of country over immediate victory, dooms the labor movement for decades. The miners' respect for American institutions becomes the weapon used to defeat them. Their belief in American democracy prevents them from destroying the forces that are destroying American democracy. The aftermath is swift, brutal, and systematic. Hundreds of miners are arrested and charged with treason, murder, and conspiracy against the United States. Think about that for a moment. American workers fighting for basic constitutional rights are charged with treason against the country whose constitution they're trying to defend. The trials are kangaroo courts where corporate lawyers serve as prosecutors and company-paid judges hand down predetermined verdicts. Some miners are acquitted by sympathetic juries, but many are convicted and sentenced to years in prison. The legal system that was supposed to protect their rights instead punishes them for demanding those rights. The Union is crushed completely. The United Mine Workers, which had been growing in strength and membership, is banned from West Virginia coal fields. Anyone who participated in the march gets blacklisted from every mine in the region, making it impossible for them to work in the only industry they know. Families that had supported the miners are evicted from company housing and forced to leave the state. The corporate control that the miners had fought against becomes stronger and more oppressive than ever. Working conditions get worse, not better. Safety regulations are ignored with impunity. Wages are cut while company profits soar. The defeat at Blair Mountain gives coal companies carte blanche to treat workers however they want without fear of organized resistance. For decades, the Battle of Blair Mountain is portrayed as an embarrassing insurrection, a dangerous uprising of lawless men who had threatened the peace and order of civilized society. The complex issues that had led to the conflict, corporate exploitation, dangerous working conditions, the denial of basic labor rights, the corruption of democratic institutions, are forgotten, ignored, or deliberately misrepresented. What if they had won? What if 10,000 armed workers had successfully challenged corporate power and established their right to organize, to demand safe working conditions, to receive fair wages for dangerous work? How different would American labor history look? We'll never know, because they lost, and history is written by the winners. But here's what we do know. Those miners weren't fighting for abstract political principles or radical ideologies. They were fighting for the right to organize unions, the right to safe working conditions, the right to be paid fairly for dangerous work, the right to live with dignity in their own country. They were fighting for basic human rights in an economic system that treated them like disposable equipment. The echo from Blair Mountain is the sound of gunfire from people pushed beyond the breaking point, fighting for a shred of dignity in a system designed to crush their spirits and exploit their bodies. It's a reminder that sometimes progress requires resistance, that justice demands sacrifice, that freedom isn't free. It has to be fought for and won by people willing to risk everything for principles larger than themselves. But the longer echo is more complex and more hopeful. The miners lost the battle, but they planted seeds that would eventually grow into the labor protections we take for granted today. Every 8-hour workday, every safety regulation, every union contract, every worker protection law in America traces its roots back to places like Blair Mountain, where working people proved they were willing to fight and die for dignity. The Wagner Act, which guaranteed workers the right to organize, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established minimum wages and maximum hours, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which required safe working conditions. These didn't come from the goodness of corporate hearts or the wisdom of enlightened politicians. They came from the memory of places like Blair Mountain, where workers had been willing to take up arms for their rights. The rednecks lost the war, but their cause lived on. Corporate power defeated the miners at Blair Mountain, but it couldn't defeat the idea that working people deserve justice, dignity, and a fair share of the wealth they create. That idea survived, grew, and eventually transformed American labor relations. Today, when politicians attack unions, when corporations fight against worker safety regulations, when the wealthy claim that higher wages will destroy the economy, the ghost of Blair Mountain haunts those arguments. The miners who died on that mountain died for principles that are still under attack, for rights that are still being contested, for a vision of America where working people have power and dignity. Their echo reminds us that freedom isn't a gift, it's a conquest. Rights aren't given, they're taken. Justice isn't inevitable. It's the result of struggle, sacrifice, and the willingness of ordinary people to fight extraordinary battles against overwhelming odds. The rednecks of Blair Mountain may have lost their war, but they won their place in the long struggle for human dignity. And that struggle continues today, wherever working people stand up to power, wherever ordinary citizens demand justice, wherever the spirit of resistance lives on in the hearts of people who refuse to be broken by systems designed to break them. You think the 1960s invented free love, sexual liberation, and alternative lifestyles. You think modern polyamory is cutting edge. You think contemporary communes are radical experiments in communal living. Let me introduce you to Oneida, New York, 1850, where radical Christians were conducting the wildest, most comprehensive social experiment in American history, while the rest of the country was busy arguing about slavery and preparing for civil war. John Humphrey Noyes founded the Oneida community on a simple but revolutionary premise that challenged every assumption about human nature, social organization, and Christian morality. He believed that Jesus Christ had already returned to earth in 70 AD, which meant that the second coming had already happened, and true Christians could achieve perfection in this lifetime. If you were perfect, Noyes argued, you were no longer bound by conventional moral rules designed for imperfect beings. You could create new forms of society, new types of relationships, new ways of living that reflected your perfected spiritual state. If that sounds crazy, wait until you hear about complex marriage, mutual criticism, male continence, and stirpiculture, terms that sound like they came from a science fiction novel, but were actually the governing principles of a community that lasted 30 years and eventually became one of the most successful business enterprises in American history. Noyes looked at traditional marriage and declared it selfish, possessive, spiritually primitive, and fundamentally unchristian. Exclusive relationships, he argued, prevented the full flowering of universal love that perfect Christians should experience. If everyone was supposed to love everyone else equally, how could you justify loving just one person exclusively? How could you claim to be following Christ's commandment to love thy neighbor while excluding most neighbors from your intimate affections? His solution was revolutionary, scandalous, and surprisingly practical. Everyone marries everyone. Every man is married to every woman to every man. Romantic exclusivity was abolished. Sexual jealousy was banned. Personal attachments were discouraged. It was like a polyamorous compound managed by a religious committee with more rules than modern human resources departments and more psychological sophistication than most contemporary therapy practices. Picture living with 300 people in a massive Victorian mansion where your romantic life is managed by community elders who track your relationships, monitor your emotional attachments, and intervene whenever you show signs of developing exclusive feelings for another person. Want to date someone your own age? Get permission first. Getting too attached to one person, you'll be separated until you learn to love everyone equally. Feeling jealous about your partner's other relationships, time for some community criticism sessions to cure you of such selfish emotions. It sounds insane, psychologically impossible, and emotionally destructive. But here's the kicker, it actually worked for 30 years. 300 people lived together, worked together, loved together, raised children together, and somehow avoided killing each other, despite having the most complicated relationship structure in human history. The Oneida community's sexual arrangements were complex beyond anything imagined by modern relationship theorists or contemporary polyamory practitioners. Noyes taught that exclusive relationships were sinful because they prevented the full flowering of universal love that perfect Christians should experience. But it wasn't just free love or sexual chaos. There were elaborate rules, detailed protocols, and a sophisticated system of social control that would make modern human resources departments weep with admiration and contemporary relationship counselors shake their heads in amazement. The community practiced what Noyes called ascending fellowship, a system where older, more spiritually developed members were paired with younger, less experienced ones for both sexual education and spiritual guidance. Older men were paired with younger women to teach them sexual techniques and emotional maturity. Older women were paired with younger men for the same purpose. If you wanted to have a relationship with someone close to your own age, you had to get permission from the community elders who evaluated whether such a relationship would be spiritually beneficial or emotionally harmful. And if you got too attached to one person, if you showed signs of developing the kind of exclusive emotional bond that conventional society considered healthy and natural, you'd be separated until you learned to love everyone equally. The community had developed sophisticated techniques for detecting and eliminating special love, which they considered a form of spiritual selfishness that threatened the harmony of universal affection. Think about the psychological complexity of this system. You're living with 300 people, any of whom might be your sexual partner on any given night, but none of whom you're allowed to love exclusively. You're supposed to feel genuine affection for everyone while not getting too attached to anyone specifically. You're expected to share intimate relationships while suppressing natural human emotions like jealousy, possessiveness, and exclusive devotion. The community practiced what Noyes called male continence, a form of birth control, where men were trained to have sexual intercourse without ejaculation. This served multiple purposes. It prevented unwanted pregnancies. In a community that wanted to control reproduction carefully, it supposedly improved male health and self-control. And it allowed for sexual relationships without the biological consequences that might complicate the community's elaborate social arrangements. Male continence required extensive training, careful supervision, and remarkable self-discipline. Young men were taught by older, more experienced community members who had mastered the technique. The practice was considered both a spiritual discipline and a practical necessity. Spiritual because it demonstrated mastery over physical desires, practical because it allowed the community to separate sexuality from reproduction and manage both according to community needs rather than individual impulses. But the Oneida community wasn't just a social experiment or religious sect, it was an economic powerhouse that generated massive profits while practicing the most radical lifestyle in American history. They manufactured steel traps that were considered the best in America, so superior to competing products that professional trappers and hunters would pay premium prices for Oneida equipment. They invented new silk thread technology that revolutionized textile manufacturing. They developed innovative agricultural techniques that made their farms more productive than conventional operations. The community was completely self-sufficient in ways that would make modern environmentalists and sustainability advocates jealous. They grew their own food using advanced agricultural methods. They manufactured their own clothing using innovative production techniques. They built their own furniture in workshops that combined artistic craftsmanship with industrial efficiency. They even had their own orchestra for entertainment, their own printing press for communication, and their own school for education. Visitors came from around the world to witness this radical experiment in Christian communism that somehow generated massive profits while practicing free love. European intellectuals, American politicians, religious leaders, and curious tourists all made pilgrimages to Oneida to see how 300 people could live together without private property, traditional marriage, or conventional family structures while maintaining high productivity, social stability, and economic success. The community's success challenged every assumption about human nature, economic incentives, and social organization. Critics insisted that communal property would eliminate incentives to work hard, but Oneida members were incredibly productive and innovative. Skeptics argued that sexual freedom would lead to chaos and immorality, but the community maintained high ethical standards and remarkable social stability. Detractors claimed that abandoning traditional families would harm children, but Oneida children were healthy, well-educated, and psychologically well-adjusted. The Oneida community proved that alternative social arrangements could be more successful than conventional ones, that radical experiments could produce practical benefits, that utopian dreams could generate real-world prosperity. Their success was so undeniable that even their harshest critics had to acknowledge that whatever they were doing, it was working remarkably well. In the 1860s, noise introduced an even more radical concept that pushed the boundaries of social experimentation beyond anything attempted before or since stirpiculture, or the scientific breeding of human beings. Just as farmers bred livestock to improve their stock, noise argued, the Oneida community should breed humans to create a generation of perfect Christians who would inherit both superior genes and superior spiritual development. Community elders would select which men and women should reproduce together based on their spiritual development, intellectual capacity, physical health, and genetic potential. Children would be conceived deliberately after careful consideration, not accidentally through uncontrolled passion. Parents would be chosen for their ability to create superior offspring, not for their romantic attachments or personal preferences. The stirpiculture program was eugenics, with a spiritual twist, selective breeding justified by religious rather than racial theories. But unlike the racist eugenics movements that would later emerge in America and Europe, Oneida's stirpiculture was based on spiritual and intellectual rather than racial criteria. The goal wasn't to create a master race, but to create better Christians. 58 children were born through the stirpiculture program between 1869 and 1879. These children were raised communally, not by their biological parents in special children's quarters within the mansion house. They were educated by the entire community, not individual families, and were taught to see all adults as their parents and all other children as their siblings. The stirpiculture children were remarkably successful by conventional measures. They were healthier than average children of their era, with lower rates of infant mortality and childhood disease. They were better educated, achieving higher literacy rates and more advanced academic skills than most children in conventional schools. Many went on to successful careers in business, academia, and the professions. But they also grew up without traditional family bonds, without exclusive parental relationships, without the emotional securities that most people take for granted. Some thrived in this environment, appreciating the attention and resources of an entire community. Others struggled with questions of identity, belonging, and emotional attachment that most people never have to face. The Oneida community developed sophisticated psychological techniques for managing the complex emotional dynamics of their radical social experiment. They practiced mutual criticism, a form of group therapy where community members would analyze each other's personalities, behaviors, and spiritual development in public sessions designed to eliminate selfishness and promote spiritual growth. Imagine sitting in a room with dozens of people while they systematically critique your personality, your behavior, your spiritual development, and your emotional attachments. Every flaw is exposed, every weakness is examined, every selfish impulse is analyzed and condemned. It sounds like psychological torture, but community members claimed it was spiritually liberating, emotionally healing, and socially beneficial. The criticism sessions served multiple purposes. They enforced community standards, eliminated antisocial behavior, prevented the formation of exclusive relationships, and promoted spiritual development. But they also created intense psychological pressure to conform, suppress individuality, and maintain constant vigilance against natural human emotions like jealousy, possessiveness, and exclusive love. The community also practiced ascending fellowship in spiritual as well as sexual matters. Older, more spiritually advanced members served as mentors and guides for younger members, creating a hierarchy based on spiritual development, rather than age, wealth, or social status. This system was designed to promote spiritual growth and maintain community harmony, but it also created complex power dynamics and opportunities for manipulation. By the 1870s, the system was starting to break down for all the reasons you'd expect, and some you might not anticipate. People fell in love, despite the rules and the training and the constant supervision. They got jealous despite the criticism sessions and the spiritual counseling and the community pressure to love everyone equally. They wanted their own children rather than community children, their own relationships rather than managed partnerships, their own lives rather than collective existence. The younger generation, especially those who had grown up in the community, were increasingly rebellious and dissatisfied. They wanted to experience the outside world, to have conventional relationships, to own private property, to make their own decisions about love, work, and life. Many left for conventional lives in mainstream American society, taking their skills and knowledge but rejecting the community's social arrangements. The stirpiculture children, now young adults, were particularly resistant to community control. They had been raised to be superior beings, but they wanted to be normal people. They had been bred for perfection, but they preferred imperfection to the psychological pressure of constant scrutiny. They wanted boyfriends and girlfriends, not community-approved sexual partners. They wanted families, not collective child-rearing arrangements. The outside world was also increasing pressure on the community. Mainstream Christians were horrified by the Oneida community's sexual practices and were demanding government intervention to stop what they considered organized immorality. Local newspapers published sensational stories about free love and communist licentiousness. Politicians threatened to pass laws specifically targeting the community's practices. Religious leaders organized boycotts of Oneida products and pressured their congregations to oppose the community's influence. The federal government was threatening to prosecute Noyes for adultery, bigamy, and corrupting public morals. State authorities were considering removing children from the community on grounds of child endangerment and moral corruption. John Humphrey Noyes, reading the writing on the wall and facing potential arrest, fled to Canada in June 1879. Without their charismatic leader and spiritual guide, the community quickly decided to abandon complex marriage and reorganize as a conventional business corporation. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that nobody, not the members, not the critics, not anyone saw coming. The Oneida community didn't just disappear into the dustbin of failed utopian experiments. They didn't scatter to the winds or fade into obscurity like most 19th century communes. Instead, they transformed into something completely different, completely unexpected, and completely successful by conventional American standards. In 1880, they incorporated as Oneida Community Limited and focused entirely on manufacturing. Specifically, they started making silverware, flatware, and cutlery. The same people who had revolutionized human sexuality now set out to revolutionize American dining. Yes, that's right, that fancy silverware your grandmother breaks out for special occasions, the elegant flatware that graces holiday tables across America. The Oneida brand that's synonymous with quality and craftsmanship. It all came from a 19th century Christian free love commune. Let that sink in next Thanksgiving when you're using their forks to eat turkey while discussing family values with your relatives. The transformation was remarkably successful by any measure you want to apply. The business skills, work ethic, technological innovation, and organizational capabilities that had made the community's social experiment possible also made their commercial enterprise incredibly profitable. The same people who had revolutionized human relationships now revolutionized silverware manufacturing. Oneida became one of the most successful manufacturers of flatware in the world. They developed new production techniques that reduced costs while improving quality. They created innovative designs that appealed to American consumers. They built a brand that became synonymous with elegance, quality, and reliability. They're still in business today, more than 150 years later, making their social experiment one of the longest-lasting business ventures in American history. The irony is perfect and profound. The most radical social experiment in American history became one of the most conservative business success stories in American capitalism. The people who had rejected private property became wealthy property owners. The community that had abolished traditional marriage became a family business passed down through generations. The experiment that had challenged every conventional value became a symbol of conventional American success. The children who grew up in the Oneida community had complex, nuanced feelings about their unusual upbringing that resist simple categorization as positive or negative. Some remembered it fondly as a place of love, education, and security where they were cherished by an entire community rather than just two parents. They appreciated the intellectual stimulation, the emphasis on education, the exposure to advanced ideas about society and human nature, and the sense of being part of something larger than themselves. These positive memories emphasized the advantages of community, child rearing, multiple adult role models, diverse educational influences, extensive social support, and freedom from the psychological pressures that can develop in nuclear families. Some felt that they had received better education, more individual attention, and greater opportunities than children in conventional families. Others felt damaged by the lack of exclusive parental relationships and the constant scrutiny of community life. They struggled with questions of identity and belonging that most people never have to face. Who were their real parents? What did family mean when everyone was family? How could they form intimate relationships when they had been trained to avoid exclusive attachments? Some community children felt that they had been deprived of normal childhood experiences, conventional family bonds, and the emotional securities that most people take for granted. They resented the constant supervision, the group criticism sessions, the pressure to conform to community standards, and the inability to form close friendships without community approval. Most of them went on to live conventional lives in mainstream American society, though they carried the lessons and the scars of their unusual childhood with them forever. Many became successful in business academia, and the professions suggesting that their unconventional upbringing had provided them with valuable skills and perspectives. Some maintained lifelong friendships with other community children, forming bonds that lasted long after the community itself had dissolved. A few attempted to recreate elements of the community's social innovations in their own families and relationships, though none succeeded in establishing anything as comprehensive or long-lasting as the original Oneida community. Most seem to appreciate their unique background while preferring more conventional arrangements for their own families. The echo of the Oneida community is complex, multifaceted, and still reverberating through American culture in ways both obvious and subtle. It's the sound of a utopia that tried and failed, leaving behind a strange lesson about love, faith, capitalism, human nature, and the unexpected ways that radical experiments can evolve into conventional successes. They proved that you could create viable alternatives to traditional family structures, but they also proved that human nature has its own agenda that doesn't always cooperate with idealistic theories or spiritual disciplines. They demonstrated that communal child-rearing could produce healthy, successful children, but they also showed that the psychological costs of suppressing natural human attachments might be higher than the benefits of community cooperation. What's most fascinating is how thoroughly they succeeded at some things while failing at others. Their economic innovations outlasted their social innovations by more than a century. Their experiments with education, gender equality, and collective decision-making influenced later reform movements and social experiments. But their attempt to engineer human emotions and relationships ultimately collapsed under the weight of biological imperatives and psychological needs that couldn't be legislated, trained, or criticized away. The Oneida community reminds us that America has always been a place where people could try radical experiments, where utopian dreamers could gather followers and test their theories in real life, where social innovators could challenge conventional wisdom and established institutions. Most of these experiments failed, but they failed instructively, teaching us things about human nature and social organization that we might never have learned through conventional research or theoretical speculation. The community's story also reminds us that the line between religious faith and sexual liberation has always been blurrier than we might expect. The same people who created one of the most sexually radical communities in American history were also devoutly Christian, convinced that they were following God's will more perfectly than their conventional neighbors. Their experiments suggest that spirituality and sexuality might be more closely connected than either religious conservatives or secular liberals typically acknowledge. The Oneida community's legacy is visible today in every intentional community, every commune, every attempt to create alternative family structures or experimental social arrangements. Their insights about education, child-rearing, community cooperation, and collective decision-making influenced progressive movements for generations. Their failures warned future experimenters about the psychological and social challenges of radically restructuring human relationships. But perhaps their most important legacy is the silverware itself, the tangible reminder that America's most radical dreamers often became its most successful capitalists, that utopian experiments could evolve into practical enterprises, that the strangest chapters of American history often had the most conventional and profitable endings. The next time you use Oneida flatware, remember that you're holding a piece of America's most radical social experiment, a utopian dream that became a business empire, a testament to the strange ways that revolutionary ideas can become conservative institutions. And maybe that will make your family dinner a little more interesting. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 wasn't just America's first racist immigration law, it was a comprehensive system of legal persecution designed specifically to keep Chinese people out of the United States, while making life miserable for those who were already here. It wasn't subtle about its intentions, wasn't hidden behind euphemisms or bureaucratic language. It explicitly targeted people based on their race and nationality, making it virtually impossible for Chinese immigrants to enter the country, legally bring their families to America, or achieve the kind of stability and prosperity that other immigrant groups took for granted. But the law had a loophole, and that loophole created one of the most elaborate, sophisticated, and emotionally devastating deception schemes in American immigration history. It also created one of the most remarkable stories of resistance, creativity, and determination in the long struggle of excluded peoples to become American, despite America's best efforts to keep them out. The law allowed entry for children of Chinese American citizens. This seems reasonable until you understand how citizenship worked for Chinese immigrants. The Chinese Exclusion Act prevented Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens, but people born in America were automatically citizens regardless of their parents' status. So if a Chinese American man traveled to China and had children there, those children could theoretically immigrate to America as the children of American citizens. What emerged was a complex network where Chinese Americans would travel to China, claim to have fathered children, there then sell those slots to immigrants who desperately needed new identities, to escape poverty, persecution, or hopelessness in China. It was identity theft in reverse, people buying fake identities instead of having them stolen, purchasing fictional families instead of losing real ones. Picture this elaborate system. A Chinese-American man travels to China and registers the birth of a fictional son with American consular officials. He returns to America with legal documents proving his paternity of a child who doesn't exist. Later, he sells that identity to a young Chinese immigrant who must memorize every detail of a fictional family history, absorb a completely fabricated personal background, and enter America claiming to be that man's son. The scheme required incredible attention to detail, nerves of steel, and the ability to become someone else so completely that you could fool trained immigration officials who were specifically looking for fraud and who had years of experience detecting deception. The coaching books were the heart of the Paper Sun system, and they were masterpieces of detailed fiction that would make modern spy novels look amateurish and contemporary method actors weep with admiration. These weren't simple identity documents or basic biographical sketches. They were comprehensive life stories covering every conceivable aspect of village life, family relationships, personal history, and local geography that had to be memorized perfectly and recalled naturally under intense pressure. How many steps from your house to the village? Well, what direction does your front door face when you're standing inside, looking out? How many chickens did your family own last year? And what happened to the rooster that got sick in the spring? What were the names of your neighbors in the house with the red door who lived in the compound at the end of the path near the bamboo grove? When did your grandfather die? And what did he say on his deathbed? What was your mother wearing the last time your father visited China? And what gifts did he bring for the family? The questions went on for pages and pages, covering every conceivable detail about village architecture, local customs, family traditions, seasonal activities, religious practices, economic conditions, and personal relationships. The fake sons and daughters had to memorize hundreds of these details because immigration officials would ask seemingly random questions designed to catch people who were reciting memorized facts rather than recalling genuine experiences. But the coaching books weren't just lists of facts, they were complete fictional biographies that had to be psychologically convincing and emotionally authentic. The Paper Sons had to understand not just what happened in their fake lives, but how those experiences would have shaped their personalities, their relationships, their memories, their emotional responses to specific situations. Think about the mental discipline required for such a performance. You're not just memorizing facts like a student preparing for an exam, you're absorbing an entire fictional identity so completely that you can respond naturally and convincingly to unexpected questions, contradictory information, and deliberate attempts to confuse or trip you up. You have to become someone else while still being yourself, to inhabit a fake history while maintaining your real personality, to live a lie so completely that it becomes more real than the truth. The coaching books were often works of art in their own right, filled with detailed descriptions of village life that preserved aspects of Chinese rural culture that might otherwise have been lost. They described traditional architecture, agricultural practices, religious ceremonies, family structures, and social customs with an accuracy and attention to detail that makes them valuable historical documents. Even though they were created to facilitate deception, Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco Bay was where the Paper Sun system faced its greatest test, and it was designed to be as intimidating, confusing, and psychologically devastating as possible. Unlike Ellis Island in New York, which processed European immigrants quickly and efficiently with the assumption that most applicants were legitimate, Angel Island was built to exclude rather than include, to reject rather than welcome, to catch lies rather than process truth. The facility was deliberately isolated on an island in San Francisco Bay, cut off from legal assistance, community support, or any help from the outside world. Detainees were held in wooden barracks that looked more like prison dormitories than immigration facilities. The buildings were surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by armed officials, and designed to make clear that the people inside were suspected criminals rather than potential Americans. You're locked in a wooden barrack that the detainees called the Wooden Building, sharing cramped quarters with dozens of other Chinese immigrants who are all facing the same terrifying uncertainty. You've been there for weeks, maybe months, waiting for your interrogation, while your family in China wonders if you're dead or alive, and your fake father in America hopes you won't reveal the deception that could destroy both your futures. The walls around you are covered with poems carved by previous detainees, Chinese characters expressing homesickness, fear, anger, hope, and despair. These poems, carved into the wooden walls with makeshift tools and fingernails, tell the real story of Angel Island and the real experience of Chinese immigration. Why do I have to sit in jail? It is only because my country is weak and my family is poor. The only thing to do is to wait for the period of imprisonment to end. When I look up at the white clouds, they are drifting slowly as if they are mocking me. The low building with 3 beams merely shelters the body. It is unbearable to relate the stories accumulated on the island. Wait until the day I become successful and fulfill my wish. I will not speak of love when I level the immigration station in Burt Ars. Some detainees have been there over a year, waiting for their interrogation, waiting for appeals to be processed, waiting for relatives to provide additional documentation, waiting to find out if their performance will be convincing enough to gain them entry to America, or if they'll be deported back to China with their dreams shattered and their families' investments lost. The psychological pressure is enormous and deliberately cultivated by officials who understand that fear, uncertainty, and isolation make people more likely to confess to fraud. You've memorized a coaching book with hundreds of details about a family you've never met, a village you've never seen, a life that isn't yours. But memorization isn't enough. You have to inhabit this fictional identity so completely that you can fool experienced interrogators who have been trained to detect deception and who take pride in their ability to catch fraudulent applicants. When your moment finally comes, you're led into a room where you sit across from an immigration inspector who will ask you question after question about your supposed family, your alleged background, your fictional life in China. The interrogation can last for hours, days, or even weeks, depending on how suspicious the officials are and how many inconsistencies they think they've detected. Every answer is recorded, checked against previous testimonies, and analyzed for any hint of deception. What direction does your village face relative to the nearest market town? How many houses are between your home and the temple where your family worships? What was your father wearing when he last visited China, and what did he say about his life in America? How many rooms does your house have, and which room does your grandmother sleep in? What kind of work does your uncle do, and how much money does he make? Who was the village teacher when you were a child, and what did he teach you? Your future depends on these answers, matching exactly what your supposed father said in his interrogation years ago, what other family members have testified in their applications, what previous applicants from your alleged village have reported about local conditions. If your answers don't match perfectly, you'll be deported back to China, with your dreams shattered, and your family's investment lost. The interrogations were adversarial proceedings, where immigration officials acted more like prosecutors than civil servants, more like detectives than bureaucrats. They assumed everyone was lying and tried to prove it through aggressive questioning, trick questions, contradictory information, and psychological pressure designed to break down false identities and reveal fraudulent applications. Immigration officials would ask the same questions in different ways, looking for inconsistencies in your responses. They would ask about tiny details that might not be in the coaching books, hoping to catch you in a moment of uncertainty or confusion. They would bring in your supposed father for simultaneous questioning in a separate room, checking to see if your stories matched exactly down to the smallest detail. The psychological pressure was enormous and deliberately cultivated. You're not just pretending to be someone else, you're trying to become someone else to inhabit their identity so completely that you can fool trained interrogators who are specifically looking for deception and who have years of experience detecting the subtle signs that distinguish genuine memories from memorized facts. Think about what this means psychologically. You're erasing your own history and replacing it with a fiction that has to be more real than reality. You're denying your actual parents, your real village, your genuine experiences, and claiming a family that doesn't exist, a childhood that never happened, a life that's entirely fabricated. You're committing psychological suicide in order to achieve physical rebirth as an American. Some detainees chose actual suicide rather than face deportation and the shame of failure. They couldn't bear the thought of returning to China, having failed their families, wasted their life savings, and proven themselves unworthy of the American dream. Others confessed to fraud, hoping that honesty might earn them some consideration or reduce their punishment. But thousands succeeded, and their success created one of the most psychologically complex communities in American immigration history. The Paper Sons who successfully entered America didn't just fool immigration officials for a few hours or days. They had to maintain their false identities for decades, sometimes for the rest of their lives, while building real American families and genuine American communities. Imagine the psychological toll of living your entire life as someone else, Many paper sons never told their own children the truth about their real identities, taking their secrets to the grave, rather than burdening their American-born children with the knowledge that their family name wasn't real. Their grandfather's stories were fiction. Their entire family identity was built on necessary deception. They lived constantly with the fear of being discovered, of having their American lives destroyed by the revelation that their original entry had been fraudulent. Every interaction with government officials, every application for benefits, every encounter with authorities carried the risk of exposure. They had to remember not just their false identities, but also which identity to use, in which situation, which story to tell to which people. The false papers that had gotten their families into America became family heirlooms, documents that represented both deception and hope, both loss and survival. They were proof of successful resistance to an unjust system, but they were also reminders of everything that had been sacrificed to achieve that success. Real names, actual histories, genuine family connections that had been severed by the necessity of fraud. Children and grandchildren of paper sons grew up with complex relationships to their family histories that most Americans could never understand. Many discovered as adults that their family name wasn't really their family name, that their grandfather's stories about his childhood were actually someone else's memories, that their entire family identity was built on a foundation of creative deception. Some felt betrayed by the lies, angry that they had grown up believing in family stories that turned out to be fiction, trusting in an identity that wasn't real. Others understood that their ancestors had done what they had to do to survive and build better lives for their children, that the lies were acts of love rather than betrayal. The immigration files created by the Paper Sun system filled entire warehouses in San Francisco, creating what may be the most detailed archive of fictional family histories in world history. Every interrogation was transcribed word for word, every document was preserved, every piece of evidence was cataloged and cross-referenced, creating a vast bureaucratic record of systematic deception that immigration officials used to catch inconsistencies in later cases. It was bureaucracy as a weapon, paperwork as a form of persecution, record-keeping as a tool of exclusion. The same attention to detail that Chinese immigrants used to create convincing false identities was matched by American officials who were determined to catch and punish as many fraudulent applicants as possible. But the system also created something unintended and historically invaluable, a massive oral history project that preserved detailed descriptions of Chinese village life, family structures, agricultural practices, religious customs, and social conditions that might otherwise have been lost to time and modernization. The lies told to immigration officials became historical documents. Fictional families became windows into real social conditions. The coaching books and interrogation transcripts provide more detailed information about rural life in Guangdong province than many official historical records. Historians studying Chinese immigration now use these files to understand traditional village architecture, seasonal agricultural cycles, family relationships, religious practices, and economic conditions in ways that wouldn't be possible through conventional historical sources. The irony is perfect and profound. A system designed to exclude Chinese immigrants accidentally preserved the most detailed record of Chinese village life in American archives. The lies told to keep people out became the truth that helps us understand why they wanted to come in, how they lived before they came, and what they sacrificed to build American lives. In 1965, Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which finally abolished the racial restrictions that had made the Paper Sun system necessary in the first place. As part of the new law, the government offered amnesty to anyone who confessed to immigration fraud committed under the previous system. Thousands of paper sons came forward in what became known as the Great Confession, finally telling the truth about their identities after decades of living lies. Old men in their 70s and 80s stood up in community meetings and announced their real names, their actual histories, their genuine stories that had been buried under layers of necessary deception. The confessions were emotional events that transformed Chinese American communities and families. Families learned their real histories for the first time. Children discovered their actual surnames, their genuine ethnic identities, their true family connections. Grandchildren learned why their grandparents had always seemed secretive about their past, why certain questions had always been deflected or avoided. But not everyone confessed, and their reasons reveal the psychological complexity of living with false identities for decades. Some paper sons had lived their fictional identities for so long that those identities had become real. Their American families knew them by their fake names. Their friends called them by their false identities. Their entire social existence was built on the fiction they had created to enter America. To reveal the truth would have destroyed the lives they had built. confused the children they had raised, and complicated relationships that had been based on the false but functional identities they had maintained for half a century. For these paper sons, the fictional identities had become more real than their original names, the false families more meaningful than their biological connections. The echo of the paper sons is more complex and multifaceted than the other stories we've heard tonight. It's not the sound of violence or destruction, not the echo of armies marching or buildings burning. It's the sound of whispered conversations in interrogation rooms, of family stories being invented out of necessity of identities, being carefully constructed and jealously guarded across generations. Their history was erased not by violence but by necessity. Their true identities were buried not by persecution, but by the requirement of survival in a system designed to exclude them. Their resistance wasn't confrontational or violent, it was creative, persistent, and ultimately successful. But there's another echo too, the sound of people refusing to accept that they were unwanted, that there was no place for them in America, that their dreams of American life were illegitimate or impossible. The paper sons and daughters represent one of the most creative forms of resistance in American immigration history, a form of resistance that used America's own systems against itself. Faced with laws designed to exclude them based on their race, they created an entire alternative immigration system that allowed them to build American lives despite official hostility. They turned America's bureaucracy against itself, using the complexity of immigration law to create opportunities where none were supposed to exist. The Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't repealed until 1943, and even then only because China had become an ally in World War II, and the exclusion was diplomatically embarrassing. For 61 years, Chinese immigrants lived under a legal system that treated them as fundamentally undesirable, inherently foreign, permanently unwelcome in the country many of them had helped to build. But they didn't accept that judgment. They found ways around it, over it, and through it. Their resistance required the cooperation of entire communities. Real Chinese Americans had to create fake slots. Immigration lawyers had to facilitate fraud. Community organizations had to support deception. Families had to maintain fictions across generations. It was collective resistance disguised as individual immigration. The children and grandchildren of paper sons became doctors, engineers, teachers, entrepreneurs, artists, and public servants. They served in the American military, started successful businesses, contributed to American culture, and helped build the prosperity and diversity that define modern America. The country that had tried to exclude their ancestors eventually benefited enormously from their presence, their talents, and their contributions. Many of America's most successful Chinese American families trace their origins to paper sons who bought fake identities and lived fictional lives to achieve real American dreams. The lies their ancestors told to immigration officials became the foundation for genuine American success stories, for families that have contributed immeasurably to American prosperity and innovation. Today, when politicians debate immigration policy and argue about who deserves to be American, the story of the paper sons offers a different perspective that challenges simple answers and comfortable assumptions. Their fake papers were more real than the real papers of people who were welcomed based on their race or nationality, because those fake papers represented genuine commitment to building American lives and American families. The paper sons remind us that American immigration history is full of people who found ways to become American despite laws designed to keep them out. They prove that the difference between legal and illegal immigration is often just a matter of timing, politics, and prejudice rather than merit, character, or potential contribution to American society. Their story asks uncomfortable questions about who gets to be American and why, about what makes someone deserving of citizenship, about whether following unjust laws is more patriotic than breaking them in service of American ideals. It challenges the myth that America has always welcomed immigrants who follow the rules, because the rules themselves were designed to exclude entire groups of people based on their race and nationality. The echo of the paper sons continues today in every immigration debate, every family separated by borders, every person who has to choose between their identity and their future. It reminds us that the people we try hardest to keep out are often the ones who end up contributing the most, that the most American thing you can do might be to resist un-American laws, that sometimes the most patriotic choice is to lie to your government in service of a higher truth. Their false papers were more American than the real laws that tried to exclude them. Their fictional families were more genuine than the authentic policies that treated them as unwelcome. Their invented identities were more true to American values than the actual system that denied them the right to pursue happiness. The paper sons won in the end. They beat the system that was designed to beat them. They became Americans despite America's best efforts to keep them out. And they proved that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is to become American whether America wants you or not. 5 buried stories, a republic betrayed, a Wall Street burned, a war forgotten, a utopia turned silverware company, families built from lies that became truth. Notice the pattern. Each story follows the same trajectory, Americans doing everything right and getting screwed anyway. The Cherokee played by American rules, adopted American institutions, even won in American courts, and got ethnically cleansed for their trouble. Greenwood succeeded at capitalism, built black wealth, created black independence, and got bombed by American planes for being too successful. Blair Mountain miners fought for basic worker rights, organized democratically carried American flags, and got labeled traitors for demanding American justice. The Oneida community created a successful alternative society, generated massive profits, proved that radical experiments could work, and had to abandon their social innovations for conventional capitalism. Paper sons and daughters had to lie about their identities, deny their real families, live fictional lives, just to achieve the American dreams that other people took for granted. Here's what they don't want you to see. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed. America was never designed to be fair, just, or equal for everyone. It was designed to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of specific groups, while maintaining the fiction that everyone has an equal opportunity for success, that merit determines outcomes, that hard work guarantees rewards. The Cherokee story proves that assimilation doesn't protect you from racism, it just makes you a more successful target that threatens white supremacist assumptions about racial hierarchy. Tulsa proves that black prosperity triggers white violence because it challenges the fundamental justifications for white dominance. Blair Mountain proves that corporate power will use any force necessary to maintain control over workers who threaten profit margins. Oneida proves that alternative social arrangements threaten conventional power structures even when they're more successful than conventional arrangements. The Paper Sons prove that America's immigration system has always been about racial exclusion disguised as legal process. These stories were erased because they complicate the narrative America tells about itself, because they reveal the mechanisms of power that prefer to remain hidden, because they show the gap between American ideals and American reality. The Cherokee story destroys the myth of inevitable progress and manifest destiny. If Cherokee civilization was more advanced than white civilization, then Indian removal wasn't progress, it was regression disguised as expansion. If Cherokee democracy was more functional than American democracy, then conquest wasn't civilization, it was barbarism justified by greed. The Tulsa story demolishes the myth that racism was just ignorance, prejudice, or individual hatred. The destruction of Black Wall Street was strategic, systematic, and economically motivated. It wasn't about irrational emotions, it was about protecting white economic and political power from black competition that threatened to prove white supremacist ideology wrong. The Blair Mountain story shatters the myth of peaceful labor progress and benevolent capitalism. Workers didn't get rights through polite requests and reasonable negotiations. They got rights through organized resistance, armed struggle, and the willingness to fight and die for dignity. Corporate power didn't share control voluntarily. It was forced to compromise by workers who proved they were willing to go to war for justice. The Oneida story challenges the myth of traditional family values and conventional social arrangements. The most successful intentional community in American history practiced free love, communal child-rearing, and collective ownership. They proved that alternative social arrangements could work better than conventional ones, which threatened people who insisted that traditional arrangements were natural, inevitable, and morally superior. The Paper Sons story exposes the myth of America as a nation of immigrants who followed the rules and earned their place through merit. America has always been a nation of selective immigration, designed to welcome some people while excluding others based on race, nationality, and economic class. The immigration system was never colorblind, merit-based, or fair. It was always about maintaining demographic and political control. These aren't just historical curiosities or academic case studies, they're the foundation of modern America, the buried truths that explain why our country works the way it does, why certain patterns keep repeating, why certain problems never seem to get solved. Every broken treaty echoes Cherokee betrayal. Every time legal victory doesn't translate to actual justice, every time doing everything right still isn't enough, you're hearing the echo of Worcester versus Georgia and Andrew Jackson's refusal to enforce the Supreme Court's decision. Modern Native American communities still face the same fundamental challenge. How do you protect your sovereignty and culture in a system designed to eliminate both Tulsa echoes in every attempt to erase or minimize racial violence, every time black prosperity is seen as a threat rather than an achievement, every time silence is chosen over truth? The systematic destruction of black wealth that began with slavery, continued through Jim Crow, was perfected in Tulsa and persists today in disparities in home ownership, business ownership, and generational wealth that can't be explained by individual choices or cultural factors. Blair Mountain echoes in every labor dispute, every time workers are told that fighting for their rights is somehow un-American, every time corporate power uses violence, legal, economic, or physical, to maintain control over working people. The idea that workers should be grateful for whatever crumbs they're given, that organizing is somehow unpatriotic, that corporate profits matter more than human dignity, these are the echoes of Blair Mountain. The Oneida community echoes in every utopian experiment, every attempt to create alternative ways of living, every tension between individual desire and collective good, every time people are told that traditional arrangements are the only viable options. Their story reminds us that radical social experiments are as American as apple pie, that this country was built by people who refused to accept that things had to be the way they were. The paper sons and daughters echo in every immigration debate, every family separated by borders, every person who has to choose between their identity and their future, every time people are told they don't belong in the country they call home. Their story reminds us that the people we try hardest to keep out are often the ones who end up contributing the most, that immigration law has always been about politics and prejudice rather than merit and fairness. Here's what I want you to ask yourself, and here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. If they buried these stories, what are they burying today? What's happening right now that future generations will discover in some dusty archive and wonder how we could have let it happen? History isn't just what happened in the past, it's what we choose to remember about the past, and what we choose to remember shapes what we're able to see in the present. The same mechanisms that erased Cherokee sovereignty, Tulsa prosperity, Blair Mountain resistance, Oneida innovation, and Paper Sons creativity are still operating today, still deciding which stories get told and which get buried. Corporate media still decides which stories get coverage and which get ignored. Educational systems still teach sanitized versions of history that make current power arrangements look natural and inevitable. Political leaders still use selective memory to justify current policies and future plans. The powerful still control the narrative, still decide what counts, as important still determine which voices get heard and which get silenced. What we're choosing to forget right now, what we're deciding not to see, what we're allowing to be erased. These choices will determine what kind of country we become, what kind of future we create, what kind of echo we leave for generations that come after us. You have two options after hearing these stories, and the choice you make will determine not just how you see the past, but how you live in the present and what kind of future you help create. Option 1. Go back to believing the comfortable lies. Pretend America's story is simple and clean. Ignore the inconvenient truths that make you uncomfortable, accept the official narratives that make power look legitimate, and current arrangements seem inevitable. It's easier, less disturbing, more socially acceptable. Option 2. Start asking harder questions. Challenge every narrative that seems too convenient, too simple, too clean. Look for what's missing from official stories. Listen for the echoes of voices that were silenced. Assume that the most important parts of any story are the parts that aren't being told. It's harder, more disturbing, more socially challenging. Which kind of American do you want to be? The kind who accepts comfortable lies, or the kind who demands uncomfortable truths? The kind who believes in American mythology, or the kind who insists on American reality? The kind who trusts official narratives, or the kind who asks what those narratives are hiding? Because here's the thing, once you start seeing the patterns, you can't unsee them. Once you understand how power works to protect itself by controlling the story, you'll see it everywhere. Once you realize how much history has been buried, you'll start wondering what else is hidden, what other truths are being kept from you, what other stories need to be told. I want to know what blew your mind tonight. Cherokee constitutional government that was more advanced than most American states. The airplanes bombing American citizens in Tulsa. The true origin of redneck as a symbol of worker solidarity, that your grandmother's silverware came from a Christian sex commune. The elaborate deception system that allowed Chinese immigrants to create new identities and new families. But more importantly, I want you to become a truth teller in your own community, your own family, your own corner of the world. What story from your own background never made it into the textbooks? What local history got buried? What family secret reveals bigger truths about American society? What official narrative doesn't match what your grandparents remember? Share these stories. Tell them to your friends, your family, your social media followers. Don't let them disappear again. Don't let the next generation grow up as ignorant as we were about their own history. Because here's the thing, Every family, every community, every region has stories like these. Stories that complicate the official narrative, reveal how power really works, show the gap between American ideals and American reality. The only reason these stories stay buried is because people like us don't dig them up and share them. Thanks for joining me on this journey into America's hidden history. If this changed how you see the country, share it. If it made you angry, good, that anger is the first step toward demanding better. If it made you uncomfortable, even better, discomfort is the beginning of growth. Remember, the most important stories are always the ones they don't want you to hear. The most dangerous truths are the ones that make powerful people uncomfortable. And the most patriotic thing you can do is refuse to accept comfortable lies about your country's past or present. History isn't finished with us yet. Every generation has to decide what stories to remember, what truths to face, what echoes to listen for in the darkness. The choices we make about what to remember and what to forget will determine what kind of country we become, what kind of future we create, what kind of echo we leave for the generations that come after us. The Cherokee, the people of Greenwood, the Blair Mountain miners, the Oneida community, and the Paper sons and daughters are all still with us. Their echoes are in every struggle for justice, every fight for dignity, every attempt to build something better than what came before. Their stories remind us that America's greatest moments often came from people who refused to accept that things had to be the way they were. I'll be here in the shadows, listening for the next story that needs to be told, waiting for the next truth that needs to be uncovered, searching for the next echo that needs to be heard. Because the work of truth-telling never ends, the job of history recovering is never finished, and the responsibility of echo listening belongs to all of us. Sleep well and remember the past isn't past. It's all around us in every choice we make, and every story we choose to tell. The question is, what story will you choose to tell? What truth will you choose to uncover? What echo will you choose to amplify? Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, stay angry, and never trust anyone who says history is simple, the past is dead, or the truth is whatever makes you comfortable. The echoes are calling. Are you listening? Good night.